Welcome back to the Midnight Library. Settle in for a moment, because tonight's story takes us into the parts of history where the lights simply go out. Whole civilizations vanishing, records falling silent, and centuries dissolving into mystery. If these calm journeys into the unknown help you drift into the night, tap like and subscribe so this library stays awake. And as you get comfortable, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Watching this quiet community glow across the world is always a small wonder. Now, settle in, get comfortable, dim the lights if you'd like, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background sound. Tonight, we're going to explore something fascinating and deeply mysterious. We're going to talk about the gaps in human history, the lost epochs, the periods where civilizations simply vanished, where records went silent, where entire ways of life disappeared and left us with more questions than answers. History, as we know it, is not a continuous story. It's not a smooth timeline that flows neatly from one era to the next. Instead, it's punctuated by gaps, by dark ages, by periods where the archaeological record goes quiet and the written word ceases. These aren't just minor interruptions. These are profound silences that sometimes lasted for centuries, periods where knowledge was lost, cities were abandoned, and entire civilizations seemed to simply fade into the dust of time. What makes these gaps so intriguing is not just what we don't know about them, but what they tell us about the fragility of human civilization itself. These weren't primitive societies that disappeared. Many of them were advanced cultures with sophisticated technologies, complex social structures, and thriving economies. Yet something happened, something powerful enough to erase centuries of progress and plunge regions into darkness. Tonight, we're going to explore these lost epochs together. We'll visit the Bronze Age collapse that sent the Mediterranean world spiraling into chaos. We'll examine the mysterious Indus Valley civilization that left behind cities, but no readable texts to explain who they were. We'll stand before the enigmatic stones of Göbekli Tepe, built by people we know almost nothing about. We'll search for the phantom sea peoples who may have toppled empires. And we'll ponder the countless other mysteries that dot our past like holes in a manuscript, tantalizingly incomplete. These stories matter not because they're exotic or strange, but because they remind us that human history is far more complex and uncertain than we sometimes imagine. They show us that even great civilizations can fall, that knowledge can be lost, and that the past often guards its secrets jealously. But they also reveal human resilience, because after every dark age, civilization found a way to rebuild, to remember fragments of what came before, and to begin again. So let's begin this journey together, slowly and calmly, as we explore the lost epochs of human history. The Bronze Age collapse, when civilization fell silent. Around the year 1200, before the Common Era, something catastrophic happened across the Mediterranean world and the Near East. Within the span of just a few generations, the great Bronze Age civilizations that had dominated the region for centuries began to collapse. This wasn't a gradual decline. It was sudden, violent, and culturally disruptive. Cities that had stood for hundreds of years were burned and abandoned. Trade networks that had connected distant lands fell apart. Writing systems disappeared, and a dark age descended that would last for centuries. We call this period the Bronze Age collapse, though the name itself is somewhat misleading. It suggests a single event, a moment when everything fell apart. But the reality was more complex and more gradual. The collapse unfolded over roughly 150 years, from around 1250 to 1100 before the Common Era, though different regions experienced it at different times, and with varying degrees of severity. To understand what made this collapse so devastating, we first need to understand what the Bronze Age Mediterranean world looked like at its height. Picture a network of interconnected civilizations, each dependent on the others for resources and goods. The Mycenaean Greeks controlled much of the Aegean Sea and mainland Greece. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia, what we now call Turkey. The Egyptian New Kingdom ruled the Nile Valley and extended its influence into the Levant. The Kassites controlled Mesopotamia. Smaller kingdoms like Ugarit in Syria served as vital trading hubs connecting these great powers. These civilizations didn't exist in isolation. They were bound together by complex trade relationships. The production of bronze, the metal that gave this age its name, required copper and tin, and these metals weren't found everywhere. Copper came from Cyprus and other Mediterranean sources. Tin, much rarer, had to be imported from as far away as Afghanistan or Britain. This meant that maintaining the supply chains for bronze production required stable trade routes stretching across thousands of miles. The interconnectedness went beyond just metal. Egyptian grain fed populations throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean pottery was found in Egypt and the Levant. Hittite iron, still rare and precious, began to spread southward. Luxury goods traveled along these same routes, including ivory from Africa, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and amber from the Baltic. The elites of these civilizations corresponded with each other, exchanged gifts, arranged marriages, and negotiated treaties. We know this because archaeologists have found their letters, written on clay tablets and preserved for millennia. One particularly revealing archaeological discovery illustrates just how interconnected this world was. In the late 1400s, before the Common Era, a merchant ship sank off the coast of southern Turkey near a place called Uluburun. When divers discovered the wreck in the 1980s, they found its cargo still largely intact. The ship carried copper ingots from Cyprus, tin probably from Afghanistan, glass ingots from the Levant, amber from the Baltic, ebony from Africa, and ivory. It carried pottery from Cyprus and Canaan. It held weapons, tools, and jewelry. This single ship was a floating microcosm of the Bronze Age trading world, carrying goods from at least 7 different cultures across thousands of miles of Mediterranean waters. This was the world at its height, prosperous and interconnected. And then, beginning around 1250 before the Common Era, it began to fall apart. The collapse didn't happen everywhere at once. It began in different places at different times, but once it started, it spread like a contagion. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned around 1190. The great Mycenaean palaces at Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns were destroyed by fire. The trading city of Ugarit was burned and never rebuilt. Egyptian texts speak of invasions and chaos. Throughout the eastern Mediterranean, cities were destroyed or abandoned, never to recover their former glory. What caused this massive systemic failure? Historians and archaeologists have debated this question for decades, and the truth is that no single explanation fully accounts for what happened. Instead, most scholars now believe the collapse resulted from a perfect storm of multiple converging crises, each amplifying the others until the entire system broke down. One factor was climate change. Scientific studies of lake sediments, tree rings, and other environmental indicators show that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a severe drought lasting perhaps 150 to 300 years. This wasn't just a few dry seasons. It was a prolonged mega-drought that would have devastated agricultural production across the region. Core samples taken from the Sea of Galilee using radiocarbon dating confirm that the period from 1250 to 1100, before the Common Era, was the driest of the entire Bronze Age. The impact of such a drought would have been catastrophic for civilizations that depended on reliable harvests to feed their populations. Cities couldn't sustain themselves without agricultural surpluses. Famine would have spread. Populations would have migrated in search of water and food. Social order would have broken down. Some civilizations, like Egypt and Mesopotamia, had great rivers that continued to provide water even during droughts. The Nile still flooded annually, and the Tigris and Euphrates still flowed. But other regions weren't so fortunate. Another factor was the appearance of mysterious invaders known to history as the Sea Peoples. Egyptian texts from the time of Pharaoh Ramesses III describe attacks by coalitions of foreign peoples arriving by land and sea. These groups had names that still echo mysteriously through history: the Peliset, the Tijeka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and others. Egyptian artists depicted them in temple reliefs as fierce warriors with distinctive headgear and weapons, attacking Egyptian positions in chariots and ships. Who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? What motivated their attacks? These questions remain largely unanswered. Some scholars have tried to identify them with known groups. The Peliset might have been the Philistines who later settled in Canaan. The Shekelesh might have been Sicilians. The Denian might have been the Danans mentioned in Greek texts. But these identifications remain speculative. What seems clear is that these weren't organized invasions by unified empires. They were more likely mass migrations of displaced peoples, possibly refugees fleeing the very droughts and famines that were destabilizing the entire region. As their own lands became uninhabitable, they moved, seeking new places to settle. And when they encountered resistance, they fought. Their arrival put additional pressure on already stressed civilizations. There were other factors too. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Bronze Age cities were destroyed by earthquakes during this period. The eastern Mediterranean sits on several active fault lines, and seismic activity was common. A series of major earthquakes hitting multiple cities within a short time span could have dealt devastating blows to urban centers, already weakened by drought and conflict. Internal political instability likely played a role as well. When central governments weaken, whether due to economic stress, military defeats, or succession crises, the entire society they govern can fracture. We know from texts that some Bronze Age kingdoms experienced internal rebellions during this period. Power struggles and civil wars would have diverted resources from defense and administration, making societies more vulnerable to external threats. The interconnectedness that had made the Bronze Age world prosperous now became a liability. When trade routes were disrupted, whether by war, piracy, drought, or political chaos, the ripple effects spread quickly. A city that lost access to tin couldn't produce bronze, which meant it couldn't manufacture tools or weapons. A region that lost access to imported grain faced famine. A palace that lost tax revenues couldn't maintain its bureaucracy or army. One failure led to another in cascading waves. The collapse was most complete in the Aegean world. The Mycenaean civilization, which had produced magnificent palaces decorated with frescoes, which had developed a written script called Linear B for keeping administrative records, which had traded across the Mediterranean and may have inspired the later Greek legends of Agamemnon and the Trojan War, this civilization simply vanished. Its palaces were destroyed. Its cities were abandoned. Its writing system was forgotten. What followed in the Aegean is known as the Greek Dark Ages, a period lasting roughly from 1100 to 800 before the Common Era. During these centuries, the archaeological record shows a dramatic decline in material culture. There are no more monumental buildings. Pottery becomes simpler and less decorated. There's little evidence of long-distance trade. Most significantly, writing disappears. Linear B was lost, and literacy wouldn't return to Greece until the 8th century, when the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet to create their own writing system. Population seems to have declined sharply. Many sites that had been inhabited during the Mycenaean period show no occupation during the Dark Ages. People reverted to simpler ways of life, living in small villages rather than cities, practicing subsistence agriculture rather than producing surpluses for trade. The grand palaces with their bureaucracies and specialized craftsmen gave way to tribal chieftains ruling small territories. The situation was different in other regions. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, though significantly weakened. The New Kingdom ended around 1069 before the Common Era, giving way to the Third Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation and reduced power. But Egyptian civilization continued. Its writing system, its religious traditions, its cultural identity persisted through the crisis. The Assyrians also survived, though they too experienced a period of weakness. The Assyrian Empire contracted, losing control of outlying territories and focusing on defending its heartland. But Assyria would eventually recover and expand again in later centuries, becoming one of the great powers of the Iron Age. In the Levant, the collapse of the great powers created a power vacuum that allowed smaller groups to emerge and thrive. The Phoenician city-states, including Tyre and Sidon, became maritime trading powers, eventually establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, including the famous city of Carthage in North Africa. The Israelites, who had been a relatively minor group during the Bronze Age, began to establish their own kingdom in the highlands of Canaan. But even in regions that survived, the collapse represented a profound break with the past. The sophisticated international system of the Bronze Age, with its palace economies, its long-distance trade, its diplomatic correspondence, its artistic achievements, all of this was lost. It would take centuries for Mediterranean civilization to recover and reach comparable levels of complexity. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us several important lessons about the fragility of civilization. First, it shows us that interconnection, while bringing prosperity, also creates vulnerabilities. When one part of an interconnected system fails, the effects can cascade throughout the entire network. Second, it demonstrates that even advanced civilizations can collapse when faced with multiple simultaneous crises. Drought alone might have been manageable. Invasions alone might have been repelled. Earthquakes alone might have been rebuilt from. But all of these together, amplifying each other, proved too much. Third, the collapse reminds us that knowledge and skills can be lost. The Mycenaean Greeks had writing, but after the collapse, this skill was forgotten for centuries. When literacy returned to Greece, it came in a different form, using a different script. The continuity was broken. We have to assume that many other skills and knowledge were lost during this period, things we don't even know about because they left no trace in the archaeological record. Finally, the Bronze Age collapse shows us the importance of written records. Much of what we don't know about this period is simply because the people living through it stopped writing things down, or their writings haven't survived. The Dark Ages are dark primarily because they're poorly documented. This creates enormous gaps in our understanding of these crucial centuries. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was fundamentally different from the one that preceded it. Bronze gave way to iron as the primary metal for tools and weapons. The palace economies, with their centralized control, gave way to more diverse political systems. New peoples and new kingdoms rose to prominence. In some ways, the collapse cleared the ground for the civilizations that would follow, including classical Greece, the Persian Empire, and eventually Rome. But the collapse also represents a lost world, a sophisticated civilization whose achievements we can only glimpse through ruins and fragments. The questions persist. Could it have been prevented? What knowledge was lost that will never recover? How did ordinary people experience these catastrophic changes? The Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's great mysteries, a sobering reminder that even the mightiest civilizations can fall, and that sometimes, after the fall, the recovery takes centuries. The Greek Dark Ages, when writing disappeared. Following the Bronze Age collapse, the Aegean world entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period lasting roughly from 1100 to 800 before the Common Era. The name, Dark Ages, has sometimes been questioned by scholars who argue it's too negative. suggesting a period of complete barbarism and ignorance. But the term endures because in many ways, these centuries really were dark. Not because people lived in complete primitivism, but because this period left far fewer traces than the eras that preceded and followed it. Our knowledge of these centuries is fragmentary at best, and vast questions remain unanswered. The most striking feature of the Greek Dark Ages was the disappearance of writing. The Mycenaean palaces had used a script called Linear B to keep administrative records. Thousands of clay tablets inscribed with Linear B have been found at Mycenaean sites, documenting everything from livestock counts to religious offerings, from personnel lists to inventories of weapons and armor. These tablets give us detailed glimpses into how Mycenaean society functioned, what gods they worshipped, what resources they valued, and how their bureaucracies operated. Linear B was a syllabic script, meaning each symbol represented a syllable rather than a letter. It was used exclusively for administrative purposes, written by trained scribes who worked for the palaces. This writing system was a tool of bureaucracy, not of literature or personal communication. As far as we know, the Mycenaeans didn't use Linear B to write poetry, history, or philosophy. They used it to run their economy. When the Mycenaean palaces fell, Linear B disappeared with them. Without palaces, there was no need for complex administrative records. Without scribes employed by central authorities, there was no one to maintain the skill of writing. Linear B was forgotten so completely that when archaeologists first discovered these tablets in the early 20th century, no one could read them. It wasn't until 1952 that a British architect and amateur cryptographer named Michael Ventris finally deciphered the script, revealing that it was an archaic form of Greek. The loss of Linear B meant that for approximately 400 years, the Greeks had no writing system at all. This has profound implications for our understanding of this period. Everything we know about these centuries comes from archaeology, from the physical remains of settlements, tombs, pottery, and tools. We have no written accounts from the people who lived through this era. We don't know what they called themselves, what stories they told, what battles they fought, what kings ruled them, or what gods they primarily worshipped. We can only infer these things from material evidence. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of significant cultural simplification. During the Mycenaean period, craftsmen produced elaborate pottery decorated with complex geometric patterns and images of animals and chariots. They built monumental architecture, including the famous Tholos tombs with their massive stone domes. They created sophisticated frescoes depicting religious ceremonies, bull-leaping rituals, and palace life. They worked with precious materials including gold, lapis lazuli, and ivory. During the Dark Ages, all of this changed. Pottery became simpler, decorated with basic geometric patterns if decorated at all. There were no more monumental buildings. Frescoes disappeared. The use of luxury materials became rare. Archaeological sites from this period show settlements that were smaller and simpler than their Bronze Age predecessors. Many areas that had been densely populated during Mycenaean times show little or no habitation during the Dark Ages. This doesn't mean that Greece was completely depopulated or that people reverted to a Stone Age existence. Archaeological surveys have revealed that while some regions did see dramatic population decline, others maintained relatively stable populations, just distributed differently. Instead of living in large palace centers, people lived in smaller villages and hamlets. Instead of participating in palatial economies with specialized craftsmen and far-flung trade networks, they practiced more localized, self-sufficient economies. Some continuity did exist. People continued to speak Greek, as evidenced by the fact that when writing returned in the 8th century, it was still used to write Greek. Some religious traditions persisted. Some place names remained the same. Some pottery styles showed gradual evolution rather than complete breaks with the past. The change wasn't absolute, but it was profound enough that later Greeks had only vague, legendary memories of the Mycenaean period. These memories would eventually be preserved in the epic poems of Homer, particularly the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were probably composed in the 8th century before the Common Era, as the Dark Ages were ending. These poems tell stories set in an earlier, more heroic age, when great kings ruled from magnificent palaces and warriors fought in single combat before the walls of Troy. Many of the details in Homer's poems reflect the Mycenaean world, including the geography of Mycenaean palace centers, the names of Mycenaean-era kingdoms, and elements of Mycenaean material culture. But Homer was composing his poems at least 400 years after the events he described, relying on oral traditions passed down through generations. How much of what he described was historically accurate? How much was embellished or invented? Scholars debate these questions intensely. Some elements of Homer's world clearly reflect the Dark Ages or the archaic period when Homer lived, not the Mycenaean period he was describing. For instance, Homer describes heroes cremating their dead, which was a Dark Age practice, while Mycenaeans primarily used inhumation burial. Homer describes small-scale political organization, while Mycenaean Greece had palace bureaucracies. So Homer gives us a view of the Mycenaean world filtered through centuries of oral transmission and mixed with elements from later periods. He preserves echoes of the Bronze Age, but not a clear historical record. This is typical of how information survives across dark ages. Elements of earlier cultures persist in legend and tradition, but they become distorted, simplified, and mythologized. The line between history and myth becomes blurred. The question of what caused the Greek Dark Ages is inseparable from the question of what caused the Bronze Age collapse, since they're really two aspects of the same phenomenon. But we can ask more specific questions about the Aegean region. Why was the collapse so complete here compared to places like Egypt or Assyria? Why did writing disappear in Greece, but not in Egypt? Part of the answer may lie in the nature of Mycenaean writing. Linear B was a specialized skill tied to palace bureaucracies. Only a small elite of trained scribes knew how to read and write. When the palaces fell, these scribes lost their employment and their social function. There was no broader literate culture to maintain the skill of writing. In Egypt, by contrast, writing was more deeply embedded in the culture, used not just for administration, but for religious texts, monumental inscriptions, and other purposes. Multiple institutions, including temples and scribal schools, preserved writing skills even when centralized political authority weakened. Another factor may have been the nature of the collapse itself. The destruction of the Mycenaean palaces appears to have been violent and complete. Archaeological excavations have found layers of ash and debris indicating fires. Whether these fires resulted from attacks, earthquakes followed by fires, or both, the effect was the same. The palaces were destroyed, their archives burned, their wealth scattered or looted, and they were not rebuilt. With the disappearance of these centers of power and wealth, the entire Mycenaean system collapsed. What happened to the people who survived? Some probably fled overseas. There's evidence that Mycenaean Greeks established settlements in Cyprus and along the coast of Asia Minor during this period. Others may have migrated within Greece itself, moving from the destroyed palace centers to more remote areas. Some probably died in the violence, disasters, or famines that accompanied the collapse. Those who remained adapted to new conditions, living simpler lives in smaller communities. During the Dark Ages, Greece wasn't completely isolated from the rest of the world. There's some evidence of contact with Cyprus, the Phoenicians, and the Near East. Greek pottery from this period has been found at sites outside Greece, and foreign goods occasionally appear in Greek sites. But the level of interaction was much reduced compared to the Mycenaean period. The grand trade networks that had connected the Mycenaean palaces to Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia no longer functioned. One significant development during the Dark Ages was the spread of iron working. The Mycenaeans had primarily used bronze for tools and weapons, with iron being rare and precious. During the Dark Ages, iron gradually became more common and eventually replaced bronze as the primary metal for tools and weapons. This technological shift had important implications. Iron ore was more widely available than the copper and tin needed for bronze, meaning communities could be more self-sufficient in metal production. Iron tools, when properly made, could also be harder and hold an edge better than bronze. The transition to iron wasn't instantaneous or uniform. It was a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries. But by the end of the Dark Ages, iron had become dominant, marking the beginning of the Iron Age in Greece. This technological change is one reason why some scholars prefer terms like Early Iron Age to Dark Ages when describing this period, since it emphasizes continuity and development rather than decline. As the Dark Ages progressed, things began slowly to improve. Population appears to have stabilized and then started to increase. Archaeological sites become more numerous and show evidence of increasing prosperity. Burial goods become more elaborate. Long-distance trade begins to revive. And most significantly, writing returns to Greece. The writing system that the Greeks adopted in the 8th century wasn't linear B. That script had been forgotten. Instead, the Greeks adapted the alphabet that had been developed by the Phoenicians, the Semitic-speaking people who lived along the coast of modern-day Lebanon and Syria. The Phoenician alphabet was simpler than linear B, using symbols to represent individual sounds rather than syllables. It was also more flexible and easier to learn. The Greeks modified the Phoenician alphabet by adding symbols for vowels, which the Phoenician system had omitted. This created the first true alphabet in the modern sense, a writing system that could easily and accurately represent speech. Greek became the first European language to be written in an alphabetic script. From this Greek alphabet would eventually derive the Latin alphabet used for English and most other Western languages, as well as the Cyrillic alphabet used for Russian and other Slavic languages. The return of writing marks the end of the Greek Dark Ages and the beginning of the Archaic period. Suddenly, we have written sources again. We have inscriptions on monuments, laws carved on stone, poetry written down, historical accounts, philosophical texts. The silence is broken. Ancient Greek civilization, which would go on to produce democracy, philosophy, drama, architecture, and art that still influences the world today, begins to emerge from the darkness. But 400 years had been lost. 400 years during which we have only the faintest glimpses of what was happening. 400 years that separate the Mycenaean world, described by linear B tablets, from the archaic Greek world, described in Homer and Hesiod. This gap in our knowledge represents one of the great mysteries of ancient history. The Greek Dark Ages raise profound questions about cultural memory and historical continuity. How much did the Greeks of the Archaic period remember about their Mycenaean ancestors? They clearly preserved some memories, as evidenced by Homer's epics and by the fact that certain place names and traditions continued. But how much was forgotten? What stories were lost? What knowledge and skills disappeared forever? These questions matter not just for our understanding of ancient Greece, but for thinking about history more broadly. The Greek Dark Ages demonstrate that advanced civilizations can lose the ability to write, that sophisticated cultures can simplify, that historical memory can be disrupted. They show us that progress isn't inevitable and that knowledge, once lost, may be very difficult or impossible to recover. They also remind us of how much our understanding of the past depends on written sources. The Mycenaean period, despite being part of the Bronze Age and several centuries older than classical Greece, is in some ways better documented because the Linear B tablets give us direct contemporary evidence. The Dark Ages, despite being more recent, are more obscure because no one was writing things down. This creates an interesting paradox where ancient history isn't necessarily darkest at the most distant periods, but rather at periods when literacy disappeared. The Greek Dark Ages eventually ended. Greek civilization recovered, reorganized, and flourished in new ways. The city-states of the archaic and classical periods would achieve things the Mycenaeans never did, including democracy, philosophy, and dramatic literature. But they did so without the continuity of a written tradition connecting them to their distant past. They had to start over in many ways, building a new civilization on the ruins of an old one whose full history they could never fully know. The Indus Valley Mystery, cities without stories. On the banks of the Indus River and across the plains of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, there once flourished a civilization that was in many ways as advanced as ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. This was the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization after Harappa, one of its major cities. At its height between about 2600 and 1900 before the Common Era, this civilization built sophisticated cities, established long-distance trade networks, created elaborate systems of sanitation, and developed its own writing system. And yet, despite decades of archaeological work and hundreds of excavated sites, we know remarkably little about who these people were, what they believed, how they governed themselves, or what language they spoke. The Indus Valley Civilization is one of history's great mysteries, an advanced culture that left behind cities but no readable stories, magnificent ruins but no deciphered texts, countless artifacts but no clear explanation of what it all meant. The Indus Valley Civilization covered an enormous area, far larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. At its peak, Harappan settlements extended over an area of roughly 1.25 million square kilometers, making it the largest of all the ancient civilizations. This territory included not only the Indus River Valley itself, but also the Gagahakra River system to the east, which may have been a major waterway in ancient times, but has since dried up. Within this vast territory, archaeologists have identified over 1,400 sites associated with the Indus civilization, though only a small fraction have been excavated. The civilization included several major cities, most notably Harappa in the Punjab region and Mohenjo-Daro in Sindh, each of which may have housed 40,000 to 50,000 people at their peak. These were among the world's first great cities, comparable in size and sophistication to the cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt. What makes the Indus cities so remarkable is their planning and engineering. Unlike many ancient cities that grew organically and chaotically over time, the Harappan cities were laid out according to careful plans. Streets were arranged in grid patterns, running north-south and east-west, and intersecting at right angles. Buildings were constructed using standardized fired bricks of uniform size, suggesting centralized planning and quality control. The cities were typically divided into distinct areas, including a raised citadel area and a lower town, though the exact function of these divisions remains debated. Perhaps the most impressive feature of Harappan cities was their sanitation and drainage systems. Most houses were equipped with private bathrooms and wells. Wastewater from houses drained into covered drains that ran along the streets. These drains were carefully constructed with inspection holes and settling pits, showing sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering. This level of sanitation wouldn't be matched again until the Roman Empire, more than 2,000 years later. One of the most famous structures at Mohenjo-Daro is the Great Bath, a large rectangular pool measuring approximately 12 meters by 7 meters and 2.4 meters deep, lined with bitumen to make it waterproof. This structure was clearly used for some kind of public bathing or ritual purification, though its exact purpose remains uncertain. The presence of such a structure suggests that ritual cleanliness was important to Harappan culture, a value that persists in South Asian religious traditions to this day. The Harappan people were skilled craftspeople. They produced distinctive pottery, often decorated with geometric patterns or animal motifs. They created stone beads with remarkable precision, including tiny steatite beads drilled with such accuracy that modern jewelers marvel at them. They worked with various metals, including copper, bronze, and gold. They carved stone seals, small square stamps typically showing an animal image, and a short inscription in the still undeciphered Indus script. Thousands of these seals have been found, suggesting they were commonly used, perhaps for marking property or goods for trade. Trade was clearly important to the Indus civilization. Harappan artifacts have been found at sites in Mesopotamia, particularly at Ur and other Sumerian cities, and Mesopotamian texts from around 2300 before the Common Era mention trade with a place called Meluha, which many scholars believe refers to the Indus region. The Harappans exported cotton textiles, which they may have been the first to produce, as well as carnelian beads, ivory, and other goods. They imported metals, precious stones, and other materials that weren't available locally. The civilization's economy seems to have been primarily based on agriculture. The Indus region benefited from monsoon rains and river flooding that made the soil fertile. The Harappans grew wheat, barley, peas, sesame, and cotton. They domesticated animals including cattle, sheep, goats, and possibly chickens. Storage facilities found at Harappan sites suggest they were able to produce agricultural surpluses, which would have been necessary to support their urban populations. But despite all we've learned from archaeological excavations, we're left with enormous questions about Harappan society because we cannot read their writing. The Indus script appears on thousands of artifacts, mostly on seals, but also on pottery, copper tablets, and other objects. The inscriptions are typically short, usually just a few symbols, though some longer inscriptions exist. Scholars have identified between 400 and 600 distinct symbols in the Indus script. Numerous attempts have been made to decipher the Indus script, but none has achieved general acceptance. The difficulty lies partly in the brevity of the inscriptions. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, which could be deciphered partly because the Rosetta Stone provided the same text in 3 different scripts, or Mesopotamian cuneiform, which had very long texts to analyze, Indus script inscriptions are usually just a few symbols long. This makes statistical analysis difficult and prevents scholars from finding patterns that might reveal the underlying language. Another problem is that we don't know what language the Harappans spoke. Some scholars believe it was a Dravidian language, related to languages still spoken in southern India like Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada. Others have suggested it might have been related to the Indo-Aryan languages that later became dominant in northern India, though most scholars consider this less likely. Still others have proposed connections to other language families. Without knowing the language, it's extremely difficult to decipher the script. Some scholars have even questioned whether the Indus symbols constitute a true writing system at all. They argue that the short sequences might be religious symbols, heraldic emblems, or some other kind of non-linguistic notation system. However, most experts still believe the Indus script represents an actual writing system that recorded language, even though we cannot yet read it. The inability to read Indus inscriptions means we're missing crucial information about Harappan civilization. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know what they called their cities, their gods, or their rulers. We cannot read their laws, their literature, their prayers, or their history. Every seal, every inscription remains tantalizingly silent, holding secrets that refuse to yield to modern scholarship. This silence creates a particularly frustrating gap in our understanding because the Harappans were clearly a literate society. They had writing. They used it regularly. The widespread distribution of seals suggests that literacy, or at least the use of written symbols, was common in their commercial and administrative life. But without the ability to read these texts, we're left trying to reconstruct their civilization solely from physical remains, from bricks and bones and broken pottery. The archaeological evidence does tell us some things. The uniformity of Harappan culture across such a vast geographic area is striking. From site to site, separated by hundreds of miles, archaeologists find the same brick sizes, the same town planning principles, the same types of seals, the same pottery styles, the same weights and measures. This suggests a remarkable degree of cultural unity and possibly some form of centralized authority or shared cultural norms that enforced these standards. But what kind of political organization did the Harappans have? This remains deeply unclear. Unlike in Mesopotamia or Egypt, where we can read texts describing kings and their conquests, or where we find elaborate royal tombs and monumental sculptures of rulers, the Indus Valley has yielded nothing comparable. There are no obvious palaces or royal residences at Harappan sites. There are no statues or monuments that clearly depict rulers. The cities have citadels, raised areas that might have served administrative or religious functions, but these structures are relatively modest compared to Egyptian pyramids or Mesopotamian ziggurats. Some scholars have suggested that the Indus civilization might have been governed by a council or oligarchy rather than by kings. Others have proposed that the civilization was organized around religious authority rather than political power, with priests rather than kings holding leadership roles. Still, others have argued that the apparent uniformity of Harappan culture might have been maintained through shared religious beliefs and trading connections rather than through centralized political control. The lack of clear evidence for warfare in Harappan civilization is also puzzling. Most early civilizations have abundant evidence of military activity. Mesopotamian cities built massive defensive walls. Egyptian art glorifies pharaohs as military conquerors. Weapons are common in archaeological contexts from most ancient cultures, but Harappan sites show surprisingly little evidence of warfare. Few weapons have been found. The cities generally lack defensive walls, though there are some exceptions. There's little evidence of violent destruction in most Harappan sites. Does this mean the Harappans were peaceful? That seems unlikely for a civilization lasting so long and covering so much territory. More probably, they organized their society in ways that minimized the need for fortifications and large-scale military displays. Perhaps their cities were located in areas naturally defensible, or perhaps they maintained peace through trade relationships and diplomacy rather than through military might. But without written records, we're left to speculate. Religion in the Harappan civilization is another area shrouded in mystery. Various artifacts suggest religious or ritual practices, but their exact meaning remains elusive. Small figurines found at many sites, often showing females with elaborate headdresses, might represent goddesses or might be toys or decorative objects. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro suggests ritual bathing was important. Some seals show figures in yogic postures or wearing horned headdresses, possibly depicting gods or religious practitioners. A few seals show what might be proto-Shiva imagery, a figure seated in meditation surrounded by animals, which has led some scholars to suggest continuities between Harappan religion and later Hinduism. But these connections remain speculative. We cannot read prayers or religious texts. We don't know what gods the Harappans worshipped by name. We don't know what myths they told or what afterlife they believed in. We can see that they practiced some form of religion, as all human societies do, but the specifics remain hidden. The Harappan civilization began to decline around 1900 before the Common Era, and by around 1700 before the Common Era, the major cities had been largely abandoned. The causes of this decline have been debated extensively. Climate change appears to have played a significant role. Evidence suggests that monsoon patterns shifted, bringing less rainfall to the Indus region. The Gagahakra river system, which may have been as important as the Indus itself during the civilization's peak, appears to have dried up during this period, possibly due to tectonic changes that diverted its waters. Reduced rainfall and the loss of river systems would have devastated Harappan agriculture. Cities dependent on agricultural surpluses could not sustain themselves. Archaeological evidence shows that as the civilization declined, urban centers were gradually abandoned, and people moved to smaller rural settlements. Some populations migrated eastward toward the Ganges Valley. The sophisticated urban culture of the Harappans gave way to simpler village-based societies. The decline was gradual rather than catastrophic. There's no evidence of the kind of violent destruction that marked the end of Bronze Age cities in the Mediterranean. The Harappan cities weren't burned or sacked. They were slowly abandoned as environmental conditions made them unsustainable. People left the cities, taking with them what they could carry, leaving behind the brick structures and drainage systems that had once supported urban life. What happened to the Harappan people and their culture after the cities were abandoned? This question leads into another gap in our knowledge. The period after the decline of the Indus civilization and before the rise of later Indian civilizations is poorly documented. We know that the population didn't simply disappear. The people continued to live in the region, adapting to changed circumstances. But the urban culture, the writing system, the standardized brick sizes, the sophisticated drainage, all of this was lost. When cities would eventually emerge again in South Asia, several centuries later, they would be different. They would be built in different areas, primarily in the Ganges Valley rather than the Indus Valley. They would be associated with the Vedic culture, the Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples whose religious texts, the Vedas, would form the foundation of Hinduism. These later cities would have their own architectural styles, their own forms of organization, their own cultural characteristics. The relationship between the Harappan civilization and later Indian cultures remains a subject of debate. Some scholars see significant continuities. Certain religious symbols, certain cultural practices, certain agricultural techniques might have been passed down from Harappan times into later periods. The prominence of ritual bathing in later Indian religions might echo Harappan practices. Some aspects of later Indian urban planning might reflect Harappan traditions, though the connections are difficult to prove definitively. Other scholars emphasize the discontinuities. The Harappan writing system was completely lost, unlike in Egypt or Mesopotamia where writing continued. The specific forms of Harappan urbanism weren't replicated. The particular artistic styles of Harappan artifacts didn't persist in recognizable forms. If there were continuities, they were subtle, preserved perhaps in oral traditions, folk practices, or aspects of culture that don't leave clear archaeological traces. The mystery of the Indus civilization highlights several important points about historical knowledge and its limits. First, it reminds us that writing alone isn't enough to give us access to a culture. The Harappans had writing, but because we cannot decipher it, and because their inscriptions are short, we cannot read their thoughts or understand their society from their own perspective. We are left as outsiders, examining their material remains, but unable to hear their voices. Second, the Indus Valley shows us that sophisticated urban civilization can emerge, flourish for 1,000 years, and then decline, leaving behind enormous questions. The Harappans achieved remarkable things. They built cities that were in some ways more advanced than contemporary civilizations in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Their sanitation systems were unmatched. Their trade networks extended across the Indian Ocean. Their standardization of weights, measures, and materials suggests sophisticated administrative capabilities, and yet they remain mysterious to us. Third, the Indus civilization demonstrates that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Because we don't find royal palaces or monuments to kings, some scholars have argued that the Harappans might have had different political structures than other early civilizations. This might be true. But it's also possible that we simply haven't found the right sites or haven't correctly identified structures that had political functions. Archaeological evidence is always incomplete. What we find depends partly on what survives, partly on where we look, and partly on what we recognize as significant. The ongoing mystery of the Indus script continues to attract researchers. Modern technology offers new approaches to this ancient puzzle. Computer analysis can examine patterns in symbol sequences. Comparisons with known scripts might reveal similarities. Studies of symbols on seals might provide contextual clues. Some researchers remain optimistic that the script will eventually be deciphered. Others are more pessimistic, arguing that without bilingual texts or much longer inscriptions, decipherment may be impossible. Even if the script is never fully deciphered, archaeology continues to reveal new information about Harappan civilization. Excavations at sites like Rakhigarhi and Dolavira add to our understanding. Scientific analysis of skeletal remains, pottery, and other artifacts using modern techniques provides insights that weren't available to earlier generations of archaeologists. Ancient DNA analysis might reveal information about population movements and relationships. Paleoclimatic studies continue to refine our understanding of environmental changes, but the fundamental mystery remains. The Harappans built cities, created art, engaged in trade, raised families, worshipped gods, told stories, and lived full human lives. They had names, personalities, hopes, fears, and dreams. They made decisions that shaped their civilization's trajectory. They experienced the decline of their cities and adapted to new circumstances. And almost all of this inner life, this human experience, remains hidden from us. We stand before their ruins like visitors in a museum where all the labels have been removed. We can see the objects, admire their craftsmanship, note their functions and distributions, but we cannot read the stories they were meant to tell. The Harappans remain silent, their cities empty monuments to a lost civilization that achieved greatness but left behind more questions than answers. This gap in our knowledge spans more than 1,000 years of human history in one of the world's most important regions. The Indus Valley civilization rose, flourished, and declined, and we can only glimpse its achievements through fragmentary remains. It stands as one of history's greatest mysteries, a reminder that even urban, literate civilizations can slip into silence, leaving their secrets locked in undeciphered symbols and silent stones. Göbekli Tepe, before agriculture. In the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, not far from the Syrian border, lies one of the most revolutionary archaeological discoveries of recent decades. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, which means potbelly hill in Turkish, and it has forced archaeologists to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the origins of civilization, the development of agriculture, and the capabilities of prehistoric peoples. Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone structures, including carved pillars arranged in circles, some weighing up to 16 tons. The pillars are decorated with sophisticated reliefs showing animals including lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, and scorpions. The craftsmanship is remarkable, showing artistic skill and planning. But what makes Göbekli Tepe truly extraordinary isn't just what was built there, it's when it was built. The site dates to approximately 9500 to 8500 before the Common Era, making it roughly 11,000 years old. To put this in perspective, this means Göbekli Tepe was constructed more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge and more than 7,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were creating monumental stone architecture when humans had not yet developed agriculture, when they had not yet domesticated animals beyond dogs, when they were still living as hunter-gatherers. This discovery contradicts long-held assumptions about the relationship between agriculture and complex society. For decades, archaeologists believed that the development of agriculture was necessary before humans could create monumental architecture or complex social organizations. The reasoning seemed logical. Hunter-gatherer bands were thought to be small, mobile groups constantly moving in search of food. Only after agriculture allowed people to settle in permanent villages and produce food surpluses, so the theory went, would they have the time, resources, and organizational capacity to build large structures or support specialized craftsmen, priests, and leaders. Göbekli Tepe turns this narrative upside down. Here we have monumental architecture, sophisticated carving, and apparent ritual activity, all created by hunter-gatherers. The site shows no evidence of permanent habitation. There are no houses, no trash pits full of domestic debris, no signs that people lived there year-round. Instead, it appears to have been a special place, a ceremonial center that hunter-gatherer groups visited periodically, perhaps for festivals, rituals, or gatherings. The construction of Göbekli Tepe would have required considerable planning and labor. The stone pillars had to be quarried from limestone bedrock, shaped, transporting, erected, and carved. Some estimate that each pillar might have required 500 person-hours of labor to create and position. The site contains multiple circular structures with dozens of pillars, suggesting a massive investment of time and effort over many years or even centuries. This raises fascinating questions about the social organization of the builders. How did hunter-gatherer societies organize the labor needed for such construction? Who directed the work? How were workers fed during construction? Where did they come from? The site is located in what was then a well-watered, resource-rich area with abundant wild plants and game animals. The region's productivity might have supported larger gatherings of people than would have been possible in less favorable environments. Some archaeologists have suggested that Göbekli Tepe might represent a kind of pilgrimage center, a sacred place that drew people from wide areas for seasonal ceremonies. The labor of construction might have been part of the ritual itself, a communal activity that reinforced social bonds and shared beliefs. The site might have served as a meeting place where different hunter-gatherer bands came together to trade, socialize, find mates, and perform religious ceremonies. The animal imagery carved on the pillars provides clues about the symbolic world of the builders, though interpreting these images is challenging. Many of the animals depicted, including lions, bulls, and boars, are dangerous or powerful species that would have been important in the lives of hunters. Some pillars show anthropomorphic features, including arms and hands, suggesting they might represent human figures or supernatural beings. A few pillars display what appear to be loincloths or belts, possibly indicating status or ritual garments. The variety of animal species shown, the way they're arranged, and the absence of obvious narrative scenes all make interpretation difficult. Are these depictions of real animals hunted by the people? Are they totemic symbols representing different clans or groups? Do they represent supernatural beings or mythological creatures? Without written records or continuous cultural traditions linking us to the builders, we're left to speculate about the meaning of these carved images. One intriguing aspect of Göbekli Tepe is its apparent abandonment and deliberate burial. After being in use for approximately 1,500 years, the structures were carefully filled in with debris, effectively burying them. The pillars were covered over, the circular enclosures were filled with rubble and soil, and the site was abandoned. Why would people go to such effort to bury these structures rather than simply abandoning them? Some scholars suggest this deliberate burial might have been a ritual act, a way of ceremonially closing the site or preserving it for future generations. Others wonder if changing religious beliefs or social structures led to the site being decommissioned. The burial ensured the site's preservation, protecting the structures from weathering and destruction, which is why they survived in such good condition for 11 millennia. The timing of Göbekli Tepe's construction coincides with a crucial transition in human history. The site was built during what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic period, right at the beginning of the agricultural revolution in the Near East. Within a few thousand years after Göbekli Tepe's construction, the people of this region would domesticate wheat, barley, lentils, and other crops. They would begin keeping sheep and goats. They would transition from mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyles to settled farming villages. Some researchers have proposed controversial theories suggesting that the construction of places like Göbekli Tepe might have actually stimulated the development of agriculture rather than following it. The argument goes that gathering large numbers of people at ceremonial centers would have put pressure on local food resources. This might have created incentives to increase food production through cultivation. The need to feed people working on the monuments might have encouraged the intensification of plant gathering and eventually domestication. This remains speculative and debated. The relationship between Göbekli Tepe and the origins of agriculture is probably complex, with multiple factors influencing both. What's clear is that the monument and the agricultural transition were part of the same broad period of cultural change and experimentation. Humans were trying new things, developing new technologies, creating new social organizations, and transforming their relationship with the environment. Göbekli Tepe also raises questions about religion and belief systems in prehistoric times. The site is clearly not utilitarian. It wasn't built for shelter, defense, or food storage. Its purpose appears to have been symbolic, ritual, or ceremonial. This tells us that sophisticated religious or ideological systems existed among hunter-gatherers much earlier than previously thought. These weren't simple societies focused only on day-to-day survival. They had complex belief systems, shared symbols, and the organizational capacity to create lasting monuments to their beliefs. The discovery has prompted archaeologists to look more carefully at other sites in the region. Since Göbekli Tepe's excavation began in the 1990s, several other similar sites have been found in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, including Karahan Tepe, Nevali Sori, and others. These sites show similar architectural features, carved pillars, and apparent ritual functions. Together, they suggest a broader cultural phenomenon, a tradition of monument building among late hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies in the northern Fertile Crescent. The excavation of Göbekli Tepe is ongoing and much remains to be discovered. The site is large and only a small portion has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey techniques suggest there are many more structures still buried, potentially dozens of circular enclosures with hundreds of carved pillars waiting to be revealed. Each new excavation season brings new discoveries and new questions. What happened to the people who built Göbekli Tepe? Their direct descendants likely became the early farming communities of the Neolithic Near East. The transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer wasn't instantaneous or universal. It was a gradual process that unfolded over thousands of years, with different communities adopting agriculture at different times and to different degrees. Some hunter-gatherer traditions persisted even as agriculture spread. But the specific cultural traditions represented by Göbekli Tepe, the particular form of religious expression, the style of pillar carving, these seem to have ended when the site was buried around 8500 before the Common Era. The early farming villages that emerged in the following millennia had different architectural styles, different material cultures, different ways of organizing themselves. The cultural break suggests significant social transformations accompanied the shift to agricultural life. Göbekli Tepe represents a gap in our knowledge not because we lack physical evidence, but because the site existed in a period before writing, before recorded history, before continuous cultural traditions link us directly to its builders. We have the structures, the pillars, the carvings. But we don't have the myths, the songs, the rituals, the names of the gods, or the stories that gave meaning to these stones. We can study the site archaeologically. We can analyze the animal bones found nearby to understand what people ate. We can examine stone tools to understand their technology. We can use radiocarbon dating to establish chronology. We can compare architectural features with other sites. But the inner life of the people, their motivations, their beliefs, their social structures, these remain largely mysterious. The monument speaks to us across 11,000 years, but in a language we cannot fully understand. It tells us that our ancestors were capable of sophisticated organization and artistic expression long before we thought possible. It challenges our assumptions about the necessary preconditions for complex society. It reveals that hunter-gatherers could be monument builders, that ritual and ceremony might have been as important to human communities as food and shelter, that the capacity for symbolic thought and collective action is ancient and deeply human. But it also reminds us how much we've lost. Between us and the builders of Göbekli Tepe lies an enormous gap of time and cultural change. Whatever oral traditions, whatever stories and songs gave meaning to these stones, these have been lost. The people who could have explained the symbolism of the carved animals, who could have described the ceremonies performed among the pillars, who could have told us why this place was sacred, they are gone, and their knowledge went with them. Göbekli Tepe stands as a monument to both human creativity and human forgetting. It shows us what humans could achieve 11,000 years ago. But it also shows us how easily cultural knowledge can disappear, how quickly the meaning of even the most impressive monuments can be lost when the chain of cultural transmission is broken. The stones remain, silent and enigmatic, beautiful but mute, testaments to a lost world we can see but never fully know. The Sea Peoples, phantom invaders. Among the mysteries of the Bronze Age collapse, few are as enigmatic as the question of the Sea Peoples. Egyptian texts from the 13th and 12th centuries before the Common Era describe attacks by coalitions of foreign peoples arriving by sea and sometimes by land, threatening Egypt's borders and contributing to the wider chaos that was consuming the Eastern Mediterranean world. These groups are collectively known to historians as the Sea Peoples, though this term is a modern scholarly convention rather than something the people themselves used. The primary evidence for the Sea Peoples comes from Egyptian sources, particularly inscriptions and reliefs from the reigns of Pharaoh Merneptah and his successor Rameses III. These texts describe military campaigns against invaders with exotic names: the Peliset, the Tijeka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh, and others. The reliefs show battles both on land and at sea, depicting warriors with distinctive headdresses, weapons, and ships. The most detailed account comes from Rameses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, built around 1175 before the Common Era. The temple walls contain extensive inscriptions describing what the Egyptians called the Northern War, a series of campaigns against invading forces. The texts describe a catastrophic wave of destruction sweeping across the Near East, with multiple peoples on the move, destroying cities and kingdoms in their path. According to the Egyptian account, the Sea Peoples had already devastated the Hittite Empire to the north, destroyed cities along the coast of Syria and Canaan, and were now threatening Egypt itself. The pharaoh mobilized Egypt's military forces to meet this threat, fighting battles both on the Nile Delta and along the coast. The Egyptian texts claim great victories, describing thousands of enemies killed or captured, and celebrate the pharaoh's success in defending Egypt from these mysterious invaders. But who were these Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? What motivated their migrations and attacks? Despite decades of scholarly investigation, these questions remain largely unanswered. The Egyptian texts give us names but little context. The reliefs show us what the Egyptians thought these people looked like, but artistic conventions and Egyptian biases make these depictions difficult to interpret. Some of the Sea Peoples groups have been tentatively identified with late-known populations. The Peliset are often associated with the Philistines, who settled along the southern coast of Canaan after the Bronze Age collapse, and gave their name to the region we now call Palestine. Pottery and other artifacts from Philistine sites show some similarities to Aegean styles, suggesting possible origins in the Greek world or Cyprus. However, the connections remain uncertain and debated. The Shekelesh might have been Sicilians, coming from or eventually settling in Sicily. The Denian might have been related to the Danans, one of the terms Homer uses for Greeks. The Tejeka might have settled in coastal Syria. But these identifications are largely guesswork, based on similarity of names and fragmentary archaeological evidence. We cannot be certain that the Peliset really were the ancestors of the Philistines, or that the Shekelesh came from Sicily. The names might be coincidental, or the linguistic connections might be more complex than they appear. What's particularly frustrating is that we have no sources from the Sea Peoples themselves. We see them only through Egyptian eyes, as enemies and invaders. We don't have their perspective on these events. We don't know what they called themselves or what they thought they were doing. Were they conquerors seeking new lands? Were they refugees fleeing disaster in their homelands? Were they displaced peoples pushed into motion by climate change, famine, or other crises? The Egyptian texts don't tell us. The Egyptian accounts emphasize the threat posed by the Sea Peoples and the pharaoh's success in defeating them. These texts were propaganda, meant to glorify the king and demonstrate his effectiveness as a defender of Egypt. As such, they probably exaggerate both the danger and the completeness of Egyptian victories. Reading between the lines, we can infer that Egypt faced serious challenges during this period, that the Nile Delta was under threat, and that maintaining security required significant military efforts. Some scholars have questioned whether the Sea Peoples were actually responsible for the widespread destruction in the Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age. The archaeological evidence shows many cities destroyed by fire around 1200 before the Common Era, from Greece to the Levant to Anatolia. Egyptian texts describe the Sea Peoples attacking cities and causing destruction. It's tempting to connect these two pieces of evidence and conclude that the Sea Peoples were the primary cause of the Bronze Age collapse. But the reality was probably more complex. The Sea Peoples might have been both cause and effect of the collapse. Climate change and drought might have displaced populations, setting peoples in motion who then became the Sea Peoples described in Egyptian texts. Economic disruption from failing trade networks might have led to food shortages and social breakdown, causing groups to migrate or turn to raiding. The Sea Peoples might have attacked weakened cities that were already in decline, dealing finishing blows rather than initial strikes. It's also possible that Sea Peoples is too broad a category lumping together disparate groups with different origins and motivations. Some might have been displaced Mycenaean Greeks fleeing the collapse of their own civilization. Others might have been Anatolians pushed out by the destruction of the Hittite Empire. Still others might have been indigenous populations from Syria or Canaan, displaced by drought or conflict. These various groups might have formed temporary coalitions or been confused by Egyptian scribes into seeming more unified than they actually were. The military technology and tactics attributed to the Sea Peoples in Egyptian reliefs show some interesting features. They're depicted using swords, spears, and distinctive horned or feathered headdresses. Their ships appear different from Egyptian vessels, with high prows and sterns. Some scholars have noted similarities to Aegean ship designs, suggesting possible Greek or Anatolian origins for at least some Sea Peoples groups. But ship designs were not unique to single cultures, and similar features might have developed independently or spread through contact and trade. One particularly mysterious aspect of the Sea Peoples phenomenon is the question of what happened to them after their attacks on Egypt. According to Egyptian accounts, Rameses III defeated the invaders and maintained Egypt's security. But if the Sea Peoples were defeated, where did they go? Some apparently settled in regions they had attacked. The Philistines established city-states in Canaan. Other groups might have settled in Cyprus, Syria, or Anatolia, merging with local populations or establishing new communities. But many questions remain unanswered. If these were displaced peoples, did they eventually find new homes? If they were raiders, did they move on to new targets? If they were defeated by Egypt, what prevented them from attacking again? The Egyptian texts describe complete victories, but Egypt itself entered a period of decline in the decades following these campaigns, suggesting the conflicts had been costly and perhaps not as decisive as the propaganda claimed. The mystery of the Sea Peoples intersects with broader questions about population movements and cultural change in the ancient world. Throughout history, peoples have migrated, sometimes peacefully and sometimes violently, driven by environmental change, political upheaval, or economic opportunity. The end of the Bronze Age appears to have been a period of particularly dramatic movements, with populations shifting throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. These movements had lasting effects. The political map of the region was redrawn. New peoples emerged or rose to prominence. Cultural traditions were disrupted and reformed. Languages spread or contracted. The Bronze Age palace civilizations gave way to new forms of political organization, from the tribal kingdoms of early Iron Age Greece to the Phoenician city-states to the emerging Hebrew kingdoms in Canaan. The Sea Peoples might have been agents of this transformation, or they might have been symptoms of it, or perhaps both. They represent a moment of chaos and uncertainty, a time when the old order was breaking down and the new order had not yet formed. In such times, peoples moved, cities fell, and new configurations emerged from the ruins. The gap in our knowledge about the Sea Peoples is particularly frustrating because they clearly played significant roles in one of history's great turning points. They were present at the end of the Bronze Age. They fought battles that were considered important enough to be commemorated in temple reliefs and inscriptions. They were associated with the destruction or transformation of numerous cities and kingdoms. Understanding who they were and what drove them would significantly improve our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse. But we see them only through the fragmentary and biased accounts of their enemies. We don't have their own voices, their own stories, their own explanations of their actions. We can't read their inscriptions because they left none that we've found. We can't trace their movements precisely because the archaeological record is incomplete and ambiguous. They remain phantom invaders, historically significant but personally anonymous, important but unknown. Modern scholarship continues to debate the Sea Peoples. New archaeological discoveries occasionally provide new pieces of the puzzle. Scientific techniques like ancient DNA analysis might eventually help identify the origins of populations that settled in various regions after the Bronze Age collapse. More detailed studies of pottery, architecture, and other material culture might reveal connections between different regions and periods, but fundamental questions remain unresolved. Were the Sea Peoples primarily Greeks? Were they mixed populations from multiple regions? Were they maritime raiders, or displaced farmers, or both? Did they actually destroy the cities attributed to them, or did they arrive after others had done the destruction? How many people were involved in these movements? How coordinated were their actions? These questions matter because the Sea Peoples episode represents a significant gap in our understanding of a crucial period. The Bronze Age collapse reshaped the Mediterranean world, setting the stage for classical civilization. The peoples who participated in this transformation, whether as destroyers, settlers, or refugees, were part of the story. But because we know so little about the Sea Peoples themselves, because they left us no texts and few identifiable remains, they remain shadowy figures moving through a dark and turbulent period. The Sea Peoples remind us that history's most important actors aren't always the ones who left detailed records. Sometimes the people who change history are the ones we know least about. They move through the archaeological record like ghosts, leaving traces of their presence, but no clear explanation of their identity or intentions. They show us that historical knowledge has limits, that some questions may never be fully answered, and that sometimes the most significant events are also the most mysterious. Lost libraries and burning knowledge. Throughout history, repositories of knowledge have been created and destroyed. Libraries, archives, and collections of texts represented humanity's attempt to preserve and transmit learning across generations. When these repositories were destroyed, whether through war, fire, neglect, or deliberate action, knowledge was lost, sometimes irretrievably. These losses represent some of the most tragic gaps in our understanding of the past, moments when the accumulated wisdom of generations went up in flames or crumbled to dust. The most famous of these lost libraries is the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. Founded in the 3rd century before the Common Era by the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquests, the Library of Alexandria was designed to be a universal repository of knowledge. The Ptolemies sent agents throughout the Mediterranean world to acquire texts. They copied scrolls from visiting ships, keeping the originals and returning the copies. They invited scholars to Alexandria, providing them with support to study and write. The library reportedly contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, making it the largest collection of texts in the ancient world. The library was part of a larger complex called the Mauseon, or Museum, a research institution where scholars studied everything from mathematics and astronomy to medicine and poetry. Famous figures associated with the library included Euclid, who systematized geometry, Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, and many others who made fundamental contributions to science and philosophy. But the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, and most of the texts it contained were lost. The question is how and when this destruction occurred. Popular imagination often pictures a single catastrophic fire that consumed the entire library in one dramatic conflagration. The reality was more complex and more tragic. The library appears to have declined gradually over several centuries, suffering multiple damaging events rather than one decisive destruction. The first major damage occurred in 48 before the Common Era, when Julius Caesar was besieged in Alexandria during the Roman Civil War. Caesar set fire to the Egyptian fleet in the harbor to prevent it from being used against him. The fire spread to buildings near the waterfront, and ancient sources report that this fire destroyed part of the library's collection, though the extent of damage is disputed. Some sources claim hundreds of thousands of scrolls were burned. Others suggest the damage was more limited, affecting warehouses rather than the main library building. The library continued to function for several more centuries after Caesar's time. It was still operating in the 2nd century of the Common Era when it was visited by travelers who left descriptions of its contents, but the institution was in decline. The political instability of late Roman Egypt, economic difficulties, and changing cultural priorities all contributed to the library's reduced status and support. Various accounts attribute the library's final destruction to different events. Some ancient sources blame Christian zealots in the 4th century, claiming that the bishop Theophilus ordered pagan temples and their associated libraries destroyed. Others attribute the final destruction to Muslim conquerors in the 7th century, though modern scholars consider these accounts unreliable and probably fabricated centuries after the fact. The reality is that we don't know exactly when or how the Library of Alexandria finally ceased to exist. It probably declined gradually, with its collections dispersed, damaged by fire or flood, lost to neglect, or destroyed in various conflicts that racked late Roman and early Byzantine Egypt. What was lost with the Library of Alexandria? We can only guess, but the losses were certainly enormous. The library contained texts from throughout the ancient world, including works by Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Indian, and other scholars. Many of these texts existed only in single copies or in very few copies. When they were lost forever. We know of numerous ancient authors whose works were housed in Alexandria and are now lost. Greek dramatists wrote hundreds of plays, but only a tiny fraction survive. Historians, philosophers, and scientists wrote extensively, but most of their writings have vanished. We have references to these lost works in surviving texts, tantalizing mentions that tell us something existed, but not what it contained. For example, we know that the Greek poet Sappho, who lived on the island of Lesbos around 600 before the Common Era, composed 9 books of poetry. She was celebrated throughout antiquity as one of the greatest lyric poets. But of these 9 books, only one complete poem survives intact, along with a few other fragments. The rest is lost, probably including copies that once sat on the shelves of Alexandria. We can read ancient critics praising her work, describing its beauty and emotional power, but we cannot read most of the poems themselves. The mathematician and inventor Archimedes wrote numerous treatises on mathematics, physics, and engineering. Some survive, but others are known only by title or through brief mentions in other authors' works. The method of mechanical theorems, one of Archimedes' most important works explaining his mathematical techniques, was lost for centuries. A single copy survived, hidden in a medieval prayer book where a monk had scraped off the mathematical text and reused the parchment. This palimpsest was rediscovered only in the early 20th century, revealing mathematical insights that were centuries ahead of their time. The historian Manetho, an Egyptian priest who lived in the 3rd century before the Common Era, wrote a comprehensive history of Egypt, dividing the pharaohs into 30 dynasties. This organizational scheme is still used by Egyptologists today, but Manetho's original work is lost. We know of it only through excerpts and summaries preserved in later authors' works. The full text, which would have provided invaluable information about Egyptian history from an Egyptian perspective, is gone. These are just a few examples from thousands. Ancient science, philosophy, literature, and history were far richer than the surviving fragments suggest. Every field of knowledge suffered losses. Medical texts describing ancient treatments and surgical techniques were lost. Engineering manuals explaining how the ancients constructed their buildings and machines were lost. Astronomical observations and calculations were lost. Religious texts describing beliefs and rituals were lost. The accumulated knowledge of centuries simply disappeared. The Library of Alexandria wasn't the only great library of the ancient world to be destroyed. The library at Pergamum in Asia Minor, which rivaled Alexandria in size and importance, was damaged in various conflicts and eventually declined. According to tradition, Mark Antony gave its remaining 200,000 scrolls to Cleopatra as a gift to help restock Alexandria's damaged collection, though this story may be apocryphal. The libraries of Rome suffered repeated disasters. Private libraries belonging to wealthy Romans could contain thousands of scrolls, but these collections were vulnerable to fire, a constant hazard in ancient Rome. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 of the Common Era, during the reign of Nero, destroyed many private collections along with large sections of the city. Later fires and the gradual decay of the Western Roman Empire led to the loss of countless texts. Imperial Library of Constantinople, established as the Eastern Roman Empire's answer to Alexandria, accumulated a vast collection over the centuries. It survived until the sack of Constantinople by Crusaders in 1204, when much of the collection was destroyed or dispersed. The final destruction came in 1453, when Ottoman forces conquered the city. While some texts were preserved by being copied or by Islamic scholars, many unique works were lost forever. In the Islamic world, great libraries were established in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded in the 9th century, was a center of learning where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit texts into Arabic, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. But this library too was destroyed, burned by the Mongols when they sacked Baghdad in 1258. The Tigris River was said to have run black with ink from the thousands of books thrown into it. The Library of Cordoba in Muslim Spain reportedly contained 400,000 volumes in the 10th century, making it one of the largest libraries in the world at that time. It was gradually dispersed and destroyed as Christian forces reconquered Spain, with books being burned, scattered, or lost. Only a handful of texts from this magnificent collection are known to survive. In China, the imperial libraries suffered repeated destructions throughout history. The most infamous occurred during the Qin dynasty in 213 before the Common Era, when Emperor Qin Shi Huang ordered the burning of books and the burial of scholars in an attempt to control thought and eliminate criticism of his rule. While the extent of destruction is debated by modern historians, and many texts survived through memorization or hidden copies, significant losses occurred. Later dynasties rebuilt imperial collections, but these too suffered from fires, wars, and political upheavals. The loss of ancient libraries represents more than just the destruction of physical books. It represents the severing of connections between past and present, the interruption of intellectual traditions, and the elimination of alternative perspectives on history and knowledge. When texts were lost, entire ways of thinking, entire philosophical schools, entire scientific traditions could vanish. Consider mathematics. We know that ancient mathematicians made significant advances in geometry, arithmetic, and what we would now call algebra. But many mathematical treatises were lost. How much further advanced was ancient mathematics than the surviving texts suggest? What mathematical techniques did they discover that had to be rediscovered centuries later? We know, for instance, that the Greek mathematician Diophantus worked with sophisticated algebraic methods in the 3rd century of the Common Era, but most of his 13-book work on mathematics is lost. Only 6 books survive, leaving us to wonder what the other 7 contained. The same questions arise for other fields. Ancient medicine achieved remarkable sophistication, with Greek and Roman physicians performing surgeries, prescribing medicines, and understanding anatomy and disease in ways that would not be matched again until the Renaissance. But the majority of ancient medical texts are lost. The great physician Galen, who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era, wrote hundreds of medical treatises. About a third survive, but the rest are known only through references and quotations in other authors' works. Ancient technology and engineering were far more advanced than many people realize. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device discovered in a shipwreck, contained dozens of precisely made gears that formed an analog computer for calculating astronomical positions. Dating to the 2nd century before the Common Era, it represents a level of mechanical sophistication that would not be seen again for more than 1,000 years. But there are no surviving manuals explaining how to build such devices. The knowledge was lost, and we can only marvel at the artifact itself. How many other technological achievements have been lost? How many engineering techniques, mathematical methods, medical procedures, and scientific observations disappeared with the burning of libraries? We'll never know the full extent of what was lost because the records of what once existed have themselves been destroyed. The medieval period saw further losses, though of a different kind. During the early Middle Ages in Europe, literacy declined and the production of books decreased dramatically. Monasteries preserved some classical texts by copying them, but many works were never copied, and the original manuscripts eventually decayed. Parchment was expensive, so sometimes scribes would scrape the ink off older manuscripts and reuse the parchment for new texts. These palimpsests sometimes preserved tiny fragments of lost works beneath later writing, but the original texts were deliberately erased. The process of textual transmission was selective. Medieval monks copied religious texts, works by church fathers, and classical authors deemed morally acceptable or useful for Christian education. But they had limited resources and had to choose what to preserve. Works by pagan authors, especially those seen as promoting immoral behavior or challenging Christian doctrine, were less likely to be copied. Many classical texts survived through a single manuscript, copied once in some medieval monastery. If that manuscript had been damaged or lost, the text would have disappeared entirely. This precarious preservation meant that chance played an enormous role in what survived and what was lost. Sometimes texts survived because a particular monk happened to choose them for copying. Sometimes they were lost because no one thought they were important enough to preserve. The survival of ancient literature was not based on any systematic evaluation of importance or quality, but on the random decisions of individual copyists working in scattered monasteries across Europe. The Renaissance saw a revival of interest in classical texts, and scholars searched monasteries and libraries throughout Europe for forgotten manuscripts. Some important discoveries were made during this period. Poggio Bracciolini, a manuscript hunter of the 15th century, found copies of works by Lucretius, Cicero, and other classical authors that had been sitting unread in monastery libraries for centuries. These discoveries enriched European intellectual life and contributed to the flowering of Renaissance culture. But many texts were never found because they no longer existed. By the time Renaissance scholars began searching, it was already too late for works that had been lost in the centuries after Rome's fall. The window for preservation had closed. If a text hadn't been copied during the early medieval period, if no manuscript had survived the various fires, floods, wars, and other disasters of the Middle Ages, then it was gone forever. The destruction of libraries in the Americas following European contact represents another tragic loss of knowledge. The Maya created thousands of books, called codices, written on bark paper and folded into accordion-style volumes. These codices contained astronomical tables, calendrical calculations, historical records, and religious texts. Spanish conquistadors and missionaries, viewing these books as pagan and demonic, systematically destroyed them. Diego de Landa, a Spanish bishop, conducted a mass book burning in 1562, destroying dozens of Maya codices. He later wrote that he regretted the destruction when he realized the books contained valuable historical and scientific information, but by then it was too late. Today, only 4 Maya codices survive from before the Spanish conquest. These 4 books, preserved more or less by accident, give us tantalizing glimpses into Maya science, astronomy, and religion, but they represent a tiny fraction of what once existed. Thousands of codices, containing the accumulated knowledge of Maya civilization, were destroyed. We'll never know what they contained, what stories they told, what astronomical observations they recorded, what historical events they documented. The Aztecs also created extensive written records using a pictographic writing system. These codices documented history, tribute payments, religious ceremonies, and astronomical observations. The Spanish conquistadors destroyed most of these as well, though some were copied or described by early Spanish chroniclers. Again, our knowledge of Aztec civilization is limited by these losses. We have fragments, copies, and descriptions, but the originals and most of their contents are gone. The pattern repeats throughout history. Knowledge is created, accumulated, recorded, stored, and then destroyed. Sometimes the destruction is deliberate, books burned by conquerors or religious zealots who fear different ideas. Sometimes it's accidental, libraries destroyed by fire or natural disaster. Sometimes it's through neglect, manuscripts left to decay when no one values them enough to preserve them. In more recent centuries, the loss of knowledge has continued. The destruction of the Nalanda University Library in India by invading forces in the 12th century destroyed one of the world's greatest collections of Buddhist and Hindu texts. The library at Timbuktu in Mali, which contained thousands of manuscripts on Islamic scholarship, African history, and science, suffered damage from various conflicts, though preservation efforts have saved many texts. The National Library of Iraq in Baghdad was looted and burned during the Iraq War in 2003, destroying tens of thousands of books and manuscripts, including irreplaceable historical documents. Even without physical destruction, knowledge can be lost when languages are forgotten. When the last speaker of a language dies, any texts written only in that language become unreadable unless scholars can decipher them. We've already discussed the Indus script, which remains undeciphered. Linear A, the writing system of Minoan Crete, similarly cannot be read. Etruscan, the language of the civilization that preceded Rome in Italy, is only partially understood. In each case, texts exist, but their full meaning is locked away because the language is lost. The digital age presents new challenges for knowledge preservation. While digital technology makes it easier to copy and distribute information, digital formats become obsolete rapidly. Files saved in formats from 20 or 30 years ago may no longer be readable on modern computers. Digital storage media degrades. Hard drives fail. Websites disappear. The rapid pace of technological change means that information stored digitally may be more vulnerable to loss than information written on paper or carved in stone, which can endure for centuries or millennia if properly stored. Cultural knowledge exists not just in written form, but in oral traditions, practical skills, and lived experience. When cultures are destroyed or assimilated, this knowledge can be lost even if no books are burned. Indigenous peoples around the world have lost traditional knowledge about plants, animals, and environmental management as their cultures have been disrupted. Languages carrying unique ways of understanding the world have disappeared. Skills passed from master to apprentice have been forgotten when the chain of transmission was broken. The loss of libraries and the knowledge they contained creates gaps in our understanding of history that can never be fully filled. We know these gaps exist because we have references to lost works, catalogues of libraries that no longer exist, and fragments that hint at fuller texts. But we don't know the full extent of what's been lost because many works disappeared so completely that we don't even know they existed. How many ancient authors wrote brilliant works that are now completely unknown? How many scientific discoveries were made and then lost, requiring rediscovery centuries later? How many historical events were recorded in detail in texts that no longer survive? How many religious traditions, philosophical systems, and ways of understanding the world are lost beyond recovery? These questions remind us that our knowledge of the past is fragmentary and partial. The texts that survive are not necessarily the best or most important, but simply the ones that happen to be copied enough times, stored in the right places, and lucky enough to avoid the many hazards that have destroyed most ancient books. Our view of ancient civilization is based on a tiny fraction of what once existed, like trying to understand a vast library after a fire has destroyed all but a few random volumes. The burning of libraries represents a particular tragedy because it's often deliberate. Knowledge is destroyed not by accident, but by those who fear it, who see different ideas as threatening, who prefer ignorance to the challenges that learning brings. The urge to destroy knowledge, to burn books and silence different voices, appears throughout history. It reflects a deep human insecurity, a fear of complexity and ambiguity, a desire for simple certainties rather than complicated truths. But destruction also occurs through neglect, through failure to value and preserve knowledge. When societies don't invest in libraries and education, when they don't train copyists and archivists, when they allow manuscripts to decay and buildings to crumble, knowledge is lost through passive indifference rather than active hostility. This may be even more insidious because it happens gradually and invisibly, without dramatic book burnings or infamous villains to blame. The gaps in our knowledge created by lost libraries are permanent. We can discover new archaeological sites, decipher ancient scripts, and find new manuscripts in unexpected places. Occasionally, texts thought lost are rediscovered, but the majority of lost works will never be recovered because they no longer exist in any form. The papyrus has crumbled, the parchment has rotted, the paper has burned, and the words have vanished. What remains are shadows and echoes. References in surviving texts to works now lost. Lists and catalogues describing books we can never read. Fragments of manuscripts found in trash heaps or reused as binding material in later books. These traces allow us to glimpse what once existed, but they also emphasize how much is missing, how incomplete our knowledge is, how much of human intellectual history has been erased. The story of lost libraries teaches us to value and protect the knowledge we have. It reminds us that civilization's achievements are fragile, that cultural memory can be destroyed, that the accumulated learning of generations can disappear in a single conflagration or gradually fade through neglect. It shows us that preserving knowledge requires conscious effort, institutional support, and cultural commitment. Without these, the books turn to dust and the words are lost to silence. The Younger Dryas Impact, Climate Catastrophe. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth's climate underwent a dramatic and sudden change. After thousands of years of gradual warming following the last ice age, temperatures abruptly dropped, plunging much of the northern hemisphere back into near-glacial conditions. This cold period, which lasted for roughly 1,200 years, is known as the Younger Dryas, named after a flower called Dryas octopetala that thrived in the cold tundra conditions that returned during this time. The Younger Dryas represents a significant mystery in Earth's climate history. What could cause such a sudden and dramatic cooling? Why did it affect some regions more severely than others? What triggered the equally abrupt warming that ended the Younger Dryas and ushered in the current warm period called the Holocene? And most intriguingly for our purposes, what impact did this climate catastrophe have on human populations and the development of civilization? The evidence for the Younger Dryas cooling comes from multiple sources. Ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet show a sharp spike in oxygen isotope ratios, indicating a sudden drop in temperature. These cores preserve annual layers of ice going back tens of thousands of years, providing a detailed climate record. The transition into the Younger Dryas appears in these cores as a dramatic shift occurring within just a few decades, possibly even a few years. The warming at the end of the Younger Dryas was equally abrupt. Lake sediments, pollen records, and glacial deposits from around the world corroborate this evidence. In Europe, forests that had begun to spread northward as the Ice Age ended were replaced by tundra vegetation. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. In North America, similar changes occurred. The impact appears to have been strongest in the North Atlantic region, with lesser but still significant effects in other parts of the Northern Hemisphere. The cause of the Younger Dryas has been debated extensively. The most widely accepted explanation involves changes in ocean circulation patterns. As the Ice Age ended, massive ice sheets covering North America began melting, releasing enormous quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic. This fresh water, being less dense than salt water, could have disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system of ocean currents that includes the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream carries warm water from the tropics northward to the North Atlantic, warming Europe and eastern North America. If this circulation system was disrupted or shut down by fresh water from melting glaciers, it would have caused rapid cooling in these regions. Evidence for massive fresh water pulses into the North Atlantic during the period just before the Younger Dryas supports this explanation. However, in recent decades, an alternative and more controversial explanation has been proposed. Some researchers have suggested that the Younger Dryas was triggered by an extraterrestrial impact, either from a comet or asteroid that struck Earth or exploded in the atmosphere. This hypothesis, known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, remains highly contested, but it has sparked intense debate and research. Proponents of the impact hypothesis point to several lines of evidence. First, they note the presence of a layer of sediment dating to the beginning of the Younger Dryas that contains unusual materials including nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, carbon spherules, and elevated concentrations of iridium and platinum. These materials, they argue, are consistent with an extraterrestrial impact. Second, they point to what they interpret as evidence of massive wildfires occurring at the same time, which would be expected if an airburst or impact had occurred over North America. Layers of carbon-rich sediment, sometimes called black mats, are found at numerous archaeological sites across North America dating to this period. Third, they note that the megafauna extinctions that occurred in North America at the end of the Ice Age, including the disappearance of mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and many other large animals, coincide with the beginning of the Younger Dryas. An impact event could have contributed to these extinctions through direct destruction, climate change, or disruption of ecosystems. Fourth, some researchers have identified what they interpret as impact structures, including a possible crater beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in Greenland, though dating this crater and definitively linking it to the Younger Dryas remains uncertain. Critics of the impact hypothesis raise numerous objections. They argue that the supposed impact markers could have other explanations. Nanodiamonds can form through non-impact processes. Magnetic spherules might come from cosmic dust that constantly rains down on Earth. The black mats could result from normal processes in wetland environments rather than from wildfires. The timing of various pieces of evidence doesn't always align precisely. Most fundamentally, critics point out that no definitively identified impact crater dating to the Younger Dryas has been found, though proponents argue that if the impact occurred on ice sheets or in the ocean, the crater might have been destroyed or is difficult to locate. The debate continues, with new evidence and interpretations being published regularly. What makes this debate particularly relevant to our discussion of lost epochs is the potential human dimension. The beginning of the Younger Dryas coincides with significant changes in human societies, particularly in the Near East, where agriculture was beginning to develop. This was also roughly the period when the sophisticated hunter-gatherers who built Göbekli Tepe were active. If a major impact event occurred at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, it could have had devastating effects on human populations. An airburst over North America might have caused massive destruction across the continent, potentially contributing to the extinction of Pleistocene megafauna and the disappearance of the Clovis culture, the earliest widespread culture in North America. The climate effects, whether caused by the impact or by ocean circulation changes or both, would have disrupted human societies worldwide. Some researchers have speculated that such a catastrophe might be remembered in later flood myths and stories of apocalyptic destruction found in many cultures. The nearly universal presence of flood narratives in human mythology, from the biblical account of Noah to the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh to flood stories in cultures around the world, has long intrigued scholars. Could these stories preserve distorted memories of real catastrophes from the end of the Ice Age? Such connections must be treated with great caution. Flood myths might have multiple origins. Floods are common natural disasters that occur repeatedly throughout history, giving many cultures reason to develop such stories. The archaeological and geological evidence for a specific Younger Dryas impact remains contested. Making connections between possible prehistoric events and much later mythological traditions requires enormous leaps across time and culture. Nevertheless, the Younger Dryas period represents a real gap in our knowledge of human history during a crucial transitional period. The end of the Ice Age and the beginning of the Holocene epoch marked the dawn of agriculture and the eventual rise of civilization. Understanding what happened during the Younger Dryas, what caused it, and how it affected human populations would help us understand this crucial transition. The climate changes during the Younger Dryas were severe enough to have had significant impacts on human societies. In the Near East, archaeological evidence suggests that the development of agriculture may have been related to climate change. The Natufian culture, which preceded the development of farming, appears to have experienced stress during the Younger Dryas as wild food resources became less abundant. This stress might have encouraged experimentation with plant cultivation that eventually led to full agriculture. In Europe, human populations appear to have contracted southward as the cold returned. In North America, the Clovis culture, characterized by distinctive stone tools and widespread distribution, disappeared at roughly this time, though whether this disappearance was related to climate change, megafauna extinctions, a possible impact event, or other factors remains debated. The abruptness of the climate changes makes the Younger Dryas particularly significant. Modern climate science shows us that Earth's climate system can undergo rapid, dramatic shifts under certain circumstances. The Younger Dryas demonstrates that such shifts have occurred in the relatively recent past. Understanding what triggered these changes and how quickly they occurred has implications for understanding modern climate change and the potential for future rapid shifts. The end of the Younger Dryas was equally abrupt and dramatic. Around 11,600 years ago, temperatures rose sharply, perhaps increasing by several degrees Celsius within just a few decades. The ice sheets resumed their retreat. Forests spread northward again. The Holocene epoch, the current warm period in which all of recorded human history has occurred, had begun. This warming enabled the full development of agriculture. Stable, warm, wet conditions made farming more predictable and productive. Populations could settle in permanent villages, produce food surpluses, and eventually develop the complex societies that would become the first civilizations. The entire trajectory of human history for the past 11,000 years has unfolded during this warm period. But the younger Dryas reminds us that this stability is not permanent. Earth's climate has changed dramatically in the past and could change again. The rapidity of the changes during the younger Dryas, whether triggered by ocean circulation shifts, an impact event, or some combination of factors, shows that the climate system can shift gears quickly, with potentially devastating consequences for human societies. The mystery of the younger Dryas encompasses both scientific questions about Earth's climate system and historical questions about human responses to environmental catastrophe. While we've learned much about the climatic changes from ice cores and other geological evidence, we know far less about how humans experienced and adapted to these changes because this period occurred before written history and left limited archaeological evidence. This represents another kind of gap in our knowledge. We can document the climate changes with considerable precision. We can see that temperatures dropped and then rose again. We can measure the timing of these shifts and map their geographic extent. But we cannot easily reconstruct the human dimension, the lived experience of people dealing with dramatic environmental changes, the adaptations they made, the cultures that disappeared or transformed, the knowledge and practices that were lost or developed. Some archaeological sites spanning the younger Dryas period show changes in tool types, settlement patterns, and subsistence strategies that might reflect adaptations to changing climate. But interpreting these changes is difficult. Was a shift in tool technology a response to climate change, or was it an independent cultural development? Did settlement patterns change because of environmental factors, or because of social factors like population movements or conflicts? The archaeological evidence alone often cannot answer these questions definitively. The younger Dryas period also reminds us that human history must be understood in environmental context. We often think of history as primarily about human decisions, cultural developments, and social changes. But environmental factors can profoundly shape human possibilities and constraints. Climate change can make certain lifestyles impossible and others necessary. It can destroy societies or create opportunities for new ones to emerge. If the controversial impact hypothesis is eventually confirmed, it would add another dimension to this story. It would mean that extraterrestrial events, random cosmic accidents, can have profound effects on Earth's climate and human history. This would be a humbling reminder of humanity's place in a larger cosmos where chance events beyond our control can reshape our world. But even without an impact, the younger Dryas represents a significant episode in Earth's climate history and human prehistory. It was a period of dramatic change, occurring precisely when human societies were beginning the transition from mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyles to settled agricultural communities. Understanding this period better would help us understand one of the most important transitions in human history. The gaps in our knowledge about the younger Dryas stem from several factors. The period occurred before writing, so we have no contemporary accounts. Much of the potential evidence, especially for a possible impact event, might have been destroyed by subsequent ice movement, geological processes, or simply hasn't been found yet. The interpretation of the evidence we do have is contested, with legitimate scientific disagreements about what various findings mean. As research continues, we may gradually fill in some of these gaps. New discoveries, improved dating techniques, and better understanding of climate processes might resolve current controversies. Or the Younger Dryas may remain partly mysterious, a dramatic episode in Earth's past whose full explanation eludes us, reminding us that even recent geological and human history can contain significant unknowns. What we can say with certainty is that something dramatic happened 12,800 years ago. The climate changed rapidly. Ecosystems transformed. Human societies faced new challenges, and the world that emerged from this period, warmer and more stable, provided the environmental foundation for all subsequent human civilization. The Younger Dryas stands as a boundary between the Ice Age world and the modern world, a transition period whose full story remains partly hidden in the fragmentary evidence of ice and stone and ancient soil. Mysterious stone structures across the globe. Around the world, scattered across continents and cultures, stand massive stone structures whose construction and purpose continue to puzzle archaeologists and historians. These megalithic monuments, built by ancient peoples using technology we don't fully understand, and for reasons that remain partly mysterious, represent tangible gaps in our knowledge. We can see them, measure them, study them, but we cannot always explain them. Perhaps the most famous of these structures is Stonehenge in England. Located on Salisbury Plain, this prehistoric monument consists of massive standing stones arranged in circular patterns, with some stones weighing up to 25 tons and standing more than 20 feet tall. The structure was built in several phases over a period of roughly 1,500 years, from approximately 3000 to 1500 before the Common Era. Stonehenge's most remarkable feature is perhaps not its size, but the fact that some of its stones were transporting from remarkable distances. The larger sarsen stones came from quarries about 20 miles away, requiring enormous effort to move, but the smaller bluestones, weighing up to 4 tons each, came from the Preseli Hills in Wales, more than 140 miles away. How and why Neolithic people transporting these specific stones such great distances remains unclear. Various theories have been proposed for how the stones were moved. They might have been dragged on wooden rollers or sledges, floated on rafts along rivers and coastal waters, or moved using some combination of techniques. Experimental archaeology has shown that such transport is possible with sufficient labor, but the question remains why these particular stones were valued enough to justify such extraordinary effort. The purpose of Stonehenge is also debated. The structure is aligned with the solstices, with the main axis pointing toward the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset. This suggests astronomical significance, possibly a calendar or a place for seasonal ceremonies. Archaeological excavations have found cremated human remains, suggesting the site served funerary functions. The surrounding landscape contains numerous other ancient structures, including burial mounds and henges, indicating that this area was ritually important for thousands of years. But these observations don't fully explain what Stonehenge meant to its builders. Was it primarily a temple, an astronomical observatory, a cemetery, or something else entirely? Different phases of construction might have served different purposes. The site's meaning might have evolved over its long period of use. Without written records from the builders, we're left to interpret the physical evidence and make educated guesses. Similar mysteries surround megalithic structures elsewhere in Britain and Europe. The stone circles, standing stones, and burial chambers scattered across the landscape demonstrate that Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples invested enormous effort in stone monuments. The Ring of Brodgar in Orkney, the stone rose at Carnac in France, the passage tombs of Newgrange in Ireland all testify to sophisticated astronomical knowledge, complex social organization, and belief systems that valued permanent stone monuments. Newgrange in Ireland is particularly impressive. Built around 3200 before the Common Era, making it older than Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids, this passage tomb is constructed with such precision that once a year, on the winter solstice, sunlight enters through a roof box and illuminates the chamber at the end of a 60-foot passage. This alignment was clearly intentional, requiring careful astronomical observation and precise construction. But what rituals or beliefs motivated this remarkable achievement? Moving beyond Europe, massive stone structures appear in many other cultures. On Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean stand the famous moai, giant stone statues carved from volcanic rock. Nearly 900 of these statues were created by the Rapa Nui people between approximately 1200 and 1500 of the Common Era. The largest erected statue weighs about 75 tons and stands 33 feet tall. Many more statues remain in the quarry where they were carved, some even larger than the erected ones. The moai clearly represented something profoundly important to Rapa Nui culture. They were carved with distinctive features, transporting across the island to platforms called ahu and erected to face inland over the settlements. They probably represented ancestors or chiefs, their presence protecting and watching over the living. But many details remain uncertain. How exactly were the statues transporting? Why did statue building eventually stop? What role did the statues play in the social and environmental changes that affected Easter Island? The mystery of Easter Island's history has been complicated by competing narratives. Early theories suggested ecological catastrophe caused by deforestation and overpopulation, leading to societal collapse before European contact. More recent research suggests a more complex story involving sustainable population levels, innovative agricultural techniques, and greater resilience than previously thought, with European diseases and slave raids causing most of the population decline. The full story of Easter Island and its statues continues to be debated and refined as new evidence emerges. In South America, the megalithic site of Tiwanaku near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia presents numerous mysteries. This ceremonial center, which flourished from approximately 500 to 1000 of the Common Era, contains precisely cut and fitted stone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons. The famous Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single piece of andesite weighing about 10 tons, displays intricate reliefs, including a central figure sometimes identified with the creator god Viracocha. The precision of stone cutting at Tiwanaku is remarkable. Large blocks were cut and shaped to fit together with minimal gaps, using techniques that remain not fully understood. Some blocks show evidence of having been held together with copper or bronze clamps. The site demonstrates advanced understanding of astronomy, with structures aligned to celestial events. But like other ancient monuments, much about Tiwanaku's builders remains unknown. We don't fully understand their writing system, if they had one. We know little about their social organization or religious beliefs beyond what can be inferred from archaeological remains. The nearby site of Pumapunku, part of the larger Tiwanaku complex, is even more puzzling. Here, massive stone blocks show extraordinary precision in cutting and shaping. Some blocks have complex interlocking shapes that would challenge modern stone masons. Drill holes show remarkable uniformity. The blocks are made from hard rock, including andesite and granite, yet were shaped with great accuracy. How this was achieved with the bronze and stone tools available to Tiwanaku culture remains unclear. In Egypt, while the pyramids are famous and relatively well understood, other stone structures present ongoing mysteries. The massive stone blocks of the temples at Baalbek in Lebanon, though from the Roman period, include some of the largest stones ever used in construction. The so-called Stone of the Pregnant Woman weighs over 1,000 tons and was never moved from its quarry. How the Romans intended to transport and lift such massive stones, and why they attempted to quarry stones of such impractical size, remains unclear. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan in Egypt, had it been completed, would have weighed nearly 1,200 tons and stood 137 feet tall, making it the largest obelisk ever attempted. It cracked during quarrying and was abandoned, but its presence raises questions about Egyptian engineering capabilities and ambitions. How did they plan to move and erect such a massive monument? What techniques would have been employed? The unfinished nature of the obelisk prevents us from knowing. In Peru, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman near Cusco features massive limestone blocks fitted together with extraordinary precision. Some blocks weigh over 100 tons. They're fitted so tightly that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. The blocks have irregular, complex shapes with multiple angles and curves, yet they interlock perfectly like three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles. This precision is all the more remarkable because the Inca, who may have expanded or modified the site, but probably didn't originally construct it, had no iron tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no written language as we understand it. They worked with bronze and stone tools, yet achieved results that would challenge modern masons using power tools. The techniques they employed remain subjects of debate and experimental archaeology. Various theories have been proposed for how these stones were shaped and fitted. Perhaps wooden wedges were driven into cracks and soaked with water, the expansion splitting the rock along desired lines. Perhaps the stones were shaped by repeated heating and cooling, or by pounding with harder stones. Perhaps some kind of plant-based acid was used to soften the rock's surface, though no evidence for this technique has been found, and it seems unlikely given the hardness of the stone. The transportation of these massive blocks is equally mysterious. The quarry where the stones originated lies several miles from the construction site, across difficult terrain. How 100-ton blocks moved across this landscape? Experiments have shown that large numbers of workers using ropes and rollers could move such weights, but the logistics would have been formidable. The Inca road system, sophisticated and extensive, might have facilitated transport, though whether it existed when these particular stones were being moved remains unclear. What makes sites like Sacsayhuaman particularly intriguing is the contrast between what we know and what we don't know. We know when the Inca Empire flourished, from approximately 1400 to 1533 of the Common Era. We know much about Inca society from Spanish colonial records, archaeological evidence, and the oral traditions preserved by Inca descendants. We can read about Inca history, religion, and social organization in documents written shortly after the Spanish conquest, but we don't know for certain when or by whom many of the most impressive stone structures were built. The Inca themselves, according to Spanish chroniclers, claim that some ancient structures predated their empire and had been built by earlier peoples. They told stories of ancient builders with knowledge and powers they themselves didn't possess. Whether these stories reflected actual history or were mythological explanations for impressive ruins the Inca found and incorporated into their sites remains uncertain. This pattern appears repeatedly with megalithic structures worldwide. We can see what was built, measure its dimensions, admire its craftsmanship, and even sometimes determine when it was constructed through scientific dating. But understanding why it was built, what it meant to its builders, and sometimes even how it was constructed continues to challenge us. The massive stone jars of Laos present another enigma. Scattered across the plain of jars in the Xiangquang Plateau are thousands of large stone jars, carved from solid rock. The jars vary in size, with the largest weighing up to 14 tons and standing over 10 feet tall. They're made from various types of stone, including sandstone, granite, and limestone, and they're scattered across dozens of sites over hundreds of square miles. These jars are clearly human-made, shaped and hollowed from solid rock, but their purpose remains mysterious. Who made them? When were they created? What were they used for? Archaeological evidence suggests they date from approximately 2,000 years ago, but precise dating is difficult. Excavations have found human remains, suggesting possible funerary uses, but whether the jars were originally created as burial vessels or were later used for this purpose isn't certain. The Plain of Jars region was heavily bombed during the Vietnam War, complicating archaeological investigation and destroying some sites. Many jars were damaged or destroyed. Unexploded ordnance still litters the area, making comprehensive survey and excavation dangerous. This modern tragedy has added another layer to the mystery, as evidence that might have helped explain the jar's purpose has been lost or remains inaccessible. On the island of Malta in the Mediterranean, the megalithic temples of Malta and Gozo present yet another architectural mystery. These stone structures, built between approximately 3600 and 2300 before the Common Era, are among the world's oldest freestanding structures, predating Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. The temples demonstrate sophisticated architectural planning, with multiple chambers, carved decorations, and precise astronomical alignments. The Temple of Gigantiga, whose name means Giant's Tower, features massive limestone blocks weighing several tons each. Local folklore attributed the temples to giants, claiming that ordinary humans couldn't have built such structures. The reality, while perhaps less fantastical than giants, is no less impressive. Neolithic people with Stone Age technology quarried, transporting, and erected these massive stones, creating temple complexes that functioned for over 1,000 years. The temple's purpose appears to have been religious or ceremonial, but specifics remain unclear. Statuary found at the sites, including large female figures, suggests goddess worship or fertility cults. The astronomical alignments suggest calendrical functions or the marking of important seasonal events. But the details of the religious practices, the social organization that built and maintained these temples, and the reasons for their eventual abandonment remain mysterious. What happened to Malta's temple builders? The temple building culture ended around 2300 before the Common Era, and the islands appear to have been abandoned or suffered severe population decline. When they were resettled, the new inhabitants had no apparent cultural connection to the temple builders. The temples themselves were forgotten, buried under soil and vegetation, not rediscovered until modern times. The chain of cultural transmission was completely broken. This pattern of cultural discontinuity makes understanding ancient monuments particularly difficult. When cultures die out or are displaced, knowledge about their monuments dies with them. Later inhabitants might marvel at ancient ruins, might even incorporate them into their own belief systems or practical uses, but the original meaning is lost. The stones remain, but the stories they were meant to tell fall silent. In the Middle East, the desert regions of modern Saudi Arabia contain vast numbers of stone structures called mustatils, from the Arabic word for rectangle. These structures, visible from the air but barely noticeable at ground level, consist of low stone walls forming long rectangular enclosures, some over 400 meters in length. Recent archaeological surveys using satellite imagery have identified thousands of these structures, most dating to between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago. What were mustatils used for? Their remote locations, far from settlements and water sources, suggest they weren't practical structures like animal pens. The effort required to build them, particularly the larger ones, suggests significant importance to their builders. Some contain what appear to be altars or offering platforms with animal remains, suggesting ritual purposes. But without written records, and with only preliminary archaeological investigation, much about these structures remains unknown. The mysterious nature of these various stone structures reflects broader challenges in understanding prehistoric and ancient peoples. Physical remains survive, the stones endure, but the cultural context, the meanings and motivations, these can be lost. We're left as outsiders trying to interpret monuments created by cultures separated from us by vast gulfs of time and cultural difference. Modern archaeology brings increasingly sophisticated tools to these investigations. Laser scanning can create precise three-dimensional models of structures, revealing construction details invisible to the naked eye. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried features without excavation. Chemical analysis can determine where stones came from and what tools were used to work them. Ancient DNA from human remains can reveal population relationships and movements. Computational modeling can test hypotheses about how stones were moved or structures were built. But even with these advanced techniques, some mysteries resist solution. The meanings that stones held for their builders, the ceremonies performed among them, the songs sung and stories told in their shadows, these leave no physical trace that technology can recover. When cultures disappear without passing on their knowledge, when writing doesn't exist to record beliefs and practices, when oral traditions are broken, the interpretive gap can never be fully closed. The megalithic structures scattered across the globe remind us that throughout human history, societies have invested enormous resources in permanent monuments. From Stonehenge to Easter Island to Göbekli Tepe to the Plain of Jars, humans have moved massive stones, carved intricate designs, and created enduring structures, often at the limits of their technological capabilities. This impulse to create lasting monuments appears to be deeply human, transcending particular cultures and time periods. These monuments also represent a particular kind of gap in historical knowledge. Unlike lost texts, which we know existed but can no longer read, or lost civilizations whose existence we can only infer from fragmentary evidence, these structures are physically present. We can walk around them, touch them, measure them. The gap isn't in knowing they exist, but in understanding what they meant. This creates a peculiar frustration. The monuments stand as deliberate communications from the past, messages carved in stone meant to endure across generations. But the code for understanding these messages has been lost. We're like people who have received letters in languages we cannot read, knowing they contain important information but unable to access it. Medieval gaps and missing records. The period we call the Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century of the Common Era in Europe, is often imagined as a time of complete historical darkness, a vast gap between classical civilization and the Renaissance. This image is partly unfair. The medieval period saw significant achievements in art, architecture, philosophy, and technology. Monasteries preserved classical texts. Universities were founded. Gothic cathedrals rose. Trade networks expanded. This was not a time of complete barbarism or ignorance. Nevertheless, the medieval period does contain significant gaps in our historical knowledge, periods and places where our records thinned to nearly nothing, where events unfolded that left few traces, where populations lived and died without documentation. These gaps stem from various causes, including low literacy rates, the physical fragility of medieval records, and the selective nature of what was preserved. One of the largest gaps in European medieval history concerns the lives of ordinary people. The vast majority of medieval documents that survive come from and concern the elite: kings, nobles, bishops, and wealthy merchants. These sources tell us about wars and treaties, about church politics and theological disputes, about property transfers among the wealthy. But they tell us relatively little about the daily lives of the peasants who made up more than 90% of the population. Peasants left few written records because most were illiterate. The documents they do appear in, such as manorial records listing feudal obligations or court records documenting disputes, show them through the eyes of their lords and masters. We rarely get to hear peasants' own voices, their perspectives on their lives, their hopes and beliefs expressed in their own words. This creates an enormous gap in our understanding of medieval society. We know in general terms how the feudal system worked, what obligations peasants owed to their lords, what crops they grew, and what tools they used. But we know far less about how they experienced their lives, what they thought about their circumstances, what their family relationships were like, how they spent their leisure time, what songs they sang, what stories they told. Some glimpses into peasant life survive in unexpected places. Court records sometimes preserve testimonies from ordinary people involved in legal cases. Inquisition records, despite their grim purpose, sometimes recorded detailed testimony from accused heretics, including peasants, giving us rare windows into their beliefs and daily lives. The Paston Letters, a collection of correspondence from a 15th century English family, provide unusual insights into gentry life, though they're still far from representing the poorest levels of society. Archaeological evidence helps fill some gaps. Excavations of medieval villages reveal house types, artifact assemblages, and agricultural practices. Analysis of skeletal remains shows health, diet, and physical stress. But archaeology has limits in revealing the subjective experiences and cultural beliefs of people who left no written accounts. Another significant gap concerns medieval women's lives and experiences. Medieval records were overwhelmingly produced by men, primarily clergy, and they reflect male perspectives and interests. Women appear in these records primarily when they're connected to men of sufficient status to be documented, as wives, daughters, mothers, or widows of kings, nobles, or wealthy merchants. Lower status women are nearly invisible in written sources. We know some medieval women were literate, that some wrote letters and even books, that some managed estates and businesses, that some were powerful political figures in their own right. But their experiences and perspectives are far less documented than men's. Questions about women's daily work, their social relationships, their spiritual lives, their thoughts and feelings, these often remain in shadow due to the male-dominated nature of medieval record-keeping. Religious women, particularly nuns, are somewhat better documented because convents kept records and because some religious women wrote spiritual texts. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, whose writings on theology, medicine, and natural history survive, or Julian of Norwich, whose mystical visions were recorded, give us rare examples of medieval women's voices. But they were exceptional, representing a tiny literate elite. The experiences of ordinary women remain largely undocumented. Children are another group largely absent from medieval records. Children appear occasionally in documents recording births, baptisms, betrothals, or inheritances, but always as supporting characters in adult stories. Childhood experiences, children's perspectives, the texture of children's daily lives, these are rarely documented. We can make inferences from adult recollections, from child-rearing manuals, from archaeological evidence of toys and children's skeletal remains showing health and nutrition. But the lived experience of medieval childhood remains significantly mysterious. Geographically, some regions are far better documented than others. Medieval England, particularly from the 11th century onward after the Norman conquest, has relatively extensive records. The Domesday Book of 1086 provides a detailed survey of English landholding. Royal records, monastic chronicles, and legal documents survive in considerable numbers. Similar documentation exists for France, parts of Italy, and some other regions. But vast areas of medieval Europe are poorly documented. Eastern Europe has fewer surviving medieval records. Scandinavia's early medieval period is documented primarily through sagas written down centuries after the events they describe, mixing history with legend in ways that are difficult to untangle. The Iberian Peninsula's medieval records are complicated by the presence of multiple kingdoms, languages, and religions, with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish sources offering different perspectives that don't always align. Beyond Europe, documentation becomes even sparser. Medieval Africa, except for Muslim North Africa and regions in contact with Islamic civilization, has limited written records. Much of African history must be reconstructed from archaeology, oral traditions recorded centuries later, and accounts by outside observers like Arab travelers. Medieval Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and many other regions face similar documentation challenges. Even in relatively well-documented regions, certain periods remain obscure. The 6th and 7th centuries in Western Europe, following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, are sometimes called the Dark Ages, precisely because documentation is sparse. The 9th and 10th centuries in some regions saw significant disruptions from Viking, Magyar, and Muslim raids, and records from these turbulent periods are often fragmentary. The physical survival of medieval documents is itself a story of gaps and losses. Most medieval writing was done on parchment made from animal skins, which was expensive and time-consuming to produce. This limited what could be written down. Paper, invented in China and brought to Europe through the Islamic world, only became common in the later Middle Ages, and it was still more expensive than modern paper. Parchment documents were vulnerable to various forms of destruction. They could burn, rot in damp conditions, be eaten by insects or rodents, or simply wear out from repeated handling. Many documents were deliberately destroyed when they were no longer considered useful. Legal documents might be discarded once the property transfers they recorded were superseded. Letters might be thrown away after being read. Rough drafts and working notes were rarely preserved. Monasteries and royal chanceries tried to preserve important documents, but even these collections suffered losses. Monastery libraries could be destroyed in fires or raids. When monasteries were dissolved, as happened during the Protestant Reformation in many regions, their archives were often scattered or destroyed. Political upheavals, wars, and revolutions have repeatedly destroyed document collections throughout history. Some types of medieval documents survive in disproportionate numbers simply because they were more likely to be preserved. Religious texts, particularly liturgical books and Bibles, were carefully maintained because they were sacred. Legal documents establishing property rights were preserved because they remained practically useful. Chronicles and histories might be preserved if they concerned powerful families or institutions that maintained archives. But personal letters, business records, literary works, scientific treatises, and many other types of documents were less likely to be preserved unless they happened to end up in institutional collections. The selective nature of preservation creates particular gaps. We have better records for the wealthy and powerful because their documents were more likely to be kept. We have better documentation for institutional history than for personal life because institutions maintained archives while individuals typically didn't. We know more about official events than informal ones, more about public life than private, more about men than women, more about adults than children. Language presents another barrier to understanding medieval records. Latin was the primary written language in medieval Western Europe, used for church, legal, and scholarly documents. But vernacular languages were increasingly used for certain purposes, including literature, local administration, and personal correspondence. Reading medieval documents requires knowledge not just of these languages, but of their medieval forms, which differ significantly from modern versions. Medieval handwriting presents additional challenges. Scripts varied by region, period, and purpose. Some are relatively easy to read, while others require specialized paleographic training. Abbreviations were common, with scribes using various shorthand systems to save expensive parchment. Deciphering these abbreviations and reading the hands requires expertise that not all historians possess, meaning some documents remain partially or completely unread simply because few people can read them. Even when medieval documents can be read, interpreting them can be difficult. Medieval writers had different assumptions, used different rhetorical conventions, and sometimes deliberately obscured meanings through allegory or code. Letters might use elaborate formal language that makes their actual content unclear. Legal documents might use technical terminology whose precise meaning has been lost. Chronicles might mix factual reporting with propaganda, making it difficult to determine what actually happened. The result of these various factors is that the medieval period, despite spanning 1,000 years and despite the existence of thousands of surviving documents, remains in many ways mysterious. We can trace the general outlines of political history: who ruled where, what major wars were fought, what territories changed hands. We can follow religious history through church records, theological texts, and chronicles. We can track economic developments through trade records, coin hoards, and archaeological evidence. But vast areas of medieval life remain obscure. How did ordinary people in a particular region live at a particular time? What did they believe? What were their daily concerns? How did they relate to each other? What was it like to be a child, a woman, a merchant, a craftsman, a village priest in medieval Europe? For most times and places, we can offer only general answers based on fragmentary evidence. One specific example illustrates these challenges. The Black Death, the plague pandemic that struck Europe in the mid-14th century, killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. This was one of the most catastrophic events in human history, fundamentally reshaping European society. Yet our documentation of it has significant gaps. We have chronicles describing the plague's arrival in various cities, its symptoms, and its mortality. We have some administrative records showing sharp drops in tax revenues and abandoned properties. We have wills written by people preparing for possible death. But we have relatively little documentation of how ordinary people experienced the plague, how communities coped with mass mortality, how families dealt with loss, how social structures broke down and reformed. Archaeological evidence helps. Mass burial sites show the scale of mortality. Analysis of skeletal remains reveals information about the plague's spread and its effects on different populations. But the subjective experience, the psychological and emotional impact, the ways people tried to understand what was happening to them, these are only partially preserved in surviving records. The gaps in medieval documentation remind us that historical knowledge is always incomplete. Even for periods that seem relatively well documented, like medieval England or Renaissance Italy, enormous gaps remain. For less well-documented regions and periods, the gaps are even larger. We work with fragments, piecing together narratives from incomplete evidence, acknowledging that much of the past remains hidden. These gaps matter because they limit our understanding of how humans lived, thought, and organized their societies during a millennium of European history and longer periods elsewhere. They remind us that the past isn't simply there, waiting to be discovered in its fullness. It's partially lost, preserved only in fragments that chance and circumstance allowed to survive. The medieval period demonstrates this incompleteness perhaps more clearly than better documented periods, showing us how much can be lost even when writing exists and when we have thousands of surviving documents. archaeological puzzles still unsolved. Beyond the specific gaps and mysteries we've explored, archaeology continues to uncover puzzles that resist explanation. These are sites, artifacts, and phenomena that we can observe and document, but cannot fully understand. They represent not just gaps in historical records, but gaps in our interpretive frameworks, cases where the physical evidence doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of how ancient peoples lived and what they were capable of achieving. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, remained mysterious for decades. This corroded bronze artifact, approximately the size of a shoebox, was clearly mechanical, containing numerous gears and inscriptions. But its purpose wasn't understood until modern imaging technology revealed its internal structure in detail. The mechanism turned out to be an ancient analog computer built around the 1st century before the Common Era, designed to calculate and display astronomical information. It could predict solar and lunar eclipses, track the positions of planets, and show the phases of the moon. It incorporated dozens of bronze gears working together with remarkable precision. The sophistication of this device far exceeded anything else known from the ancient world. Nothing comparable appears again until medieval Islamic and European clockwork mechanisms more than 1,000 years later. The Antikythera mechanism demonstrates that ancient Greek technology was far more advanced than most surviving evidence suggests. If such sophisticated devices existed, why do we have only this one example? Were such mechanisms common, with this being the sole survivor? Or was it unique or extremely rare? Who built it? Was there a tradition of such devices that was lost? The mechanism opens a window on ancient capabilities that raises as many questions as it answers. The Baghdad battery, a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod discovered in Iraq in the 1930s, has sparked intense debate. Some researchers believe it was an ancient galvanic cell capable of producing electric current. If so, it would demonstrate that ancient peoples discovered principles of electricity nearly 2,000 years before modern rediscovery. Skeptics argue it was probably just a storage jar for scrolls. Chemical analysis and reproduction experiments have been inconclusive. The object's true purpose remains uncertain. In Peru, the Nazca lines present another enduring puzzle. These enormous geoglyphs, created by removing dark pebbles to reveal lighter ground beneath, depict various animals, plants, and geometric shapes. Some lines run perfectly straight for miles. The images are so large they can only be properly seen from the air, yet they were created by a culture without aircraft between approximately 400 and 650 of the Common Era. Why create images that can't be seen from ground level? Various theories have been proposed that they were astronomical markers, pathways for ceremonial processions, offerings to sky gods, or maps of underground water sources. Some of these theories have supporting evidence, but none fully explains all aspects of the lines. The truth might involve multiple purposes, or purposes we haven't considered. The crystal skulls, supposedly ancient artifacts from Mesoamerican cultures, proved to be 19th century fakes when subjected to modern analysis. This case reminds us that not all mysterious artifacts are genuine, but it also demonstrates how difficult it can be to determine authenticity and how persistent mystery and controversy can surround certain objects. Underwater archaeology continues to reveal surprising discoveries. The Yonaguni Monument, an underwater rock formation off the coast of Japan, has unusual features including what appear to be steps, terraces, and straight edges. Some researchers believe it's a man-made structure dating to the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were lower. Others argue it's entirely natural, shaped by geological processes and erosion. The debate continues, complicated by the difficulty of underwater investigation and the lack of clear associated artifacts. The Longyu caves in China, hand-carved from solid sandstone, demonstrate remarkable engineering. These artificial caverns, dating to before 212 before the Common Era, feature uniform pillars, precise angles, and sophisticated ventilation. But there are no historical records of their construction, no mention in ancient texts. Who carved them? How long did it take? What were they used for? The caves remain mysterious despite their obvious human origin. Ancient mining operations present their own puzzles. Some ancient mines penetrated deep underground, requiring sophisticated engineering to prevent collapse and provide ventilation. The ancient copper mines of the Great Lakes region in North America show evidence of extensive prehistoric mining, with thousands of tons of copper removed. But who did this mining? Where did the copper go? The Poverty Point culture in Louisiana shows evidence of copper use, but the full extent of copper trade networks remains unclear. Certain artifacts resist dating or provenance determination. The Fuente Magna bowl, supposedly found in Bolivia and covered with Sumerian-like script, has been claimed as evidence of transoceanic contact between ancient Mesopotamia and South America. However, serious scholars consider it a likely hoax due to lack of clear archaeological context and inconsistencies in the script. This case illustrates how difficult it can be to evaluate artifacts without clear provenance. The question of transoceanic contact in ancient times remains controversial. Did ancient peoples cross oceans and establish contacts between distant civilizations? Some evidence suggests limited contact was possible. Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition proved that reed boats could cross the Pacific. Genetic and linguistic evidence hints at possible ancient connections, but claims of extensive ancient transoceanic travel remain unproven and disputed. Certain architectural features appear in widely separated cultures, sometimes leading to speculation about contact or shared origins. Step pyramids appear in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Mesoamerica. Megalithic structures exist on multiple continents, but these similarities might represent convergent evolution rather than contact. Humans facing similar challenges and working with similar materials might independently develop similar solutions. The problem of interpreting rock art presents ongoing challenges. Petroglyphs and pictographs exist worldwide, some dating back tens of thousands of years, but their meanings are often unclear. Some might be representational, depicting animals or scenes from daily life. Others might be symbolic, representing spiritual concepts or recording mythological narratives. Some might have been made during trance states as part of shamanic practices. Without associated texts or continuous cultural traditions, interpretation remains speculative. Dating archaeological sites and artifacts can be challenging. Radiocarbon dating works well for organic materials younger than about 50,000 years, but it has limitations. It requires suitable organic material to be preserved. It can be thrown off by various factors, including contamination. For older materials or non-organic artifacts, other dating methods must be used, each with its own limitations and potential errors. The interpretation of burial practices presents another challenge. Why were certain individuals buried with particular objects? What did burial goods mean to the culture that interred them? A weapon in a grave might indicate warrior status, or it might be an offering to the deceased, or it might have some other significance we don't recognize. The position of the body, the construction of the tomb, the associated rituals, all of these might carry meanings that are difficult to decode from physical evidence alone. The terracotta army in China, the thousands of life-sized clay soldiers buried with the first Emperor Qin Shi Huang around 210 before the Common Era, demonstrates both what archaeology can reveal and what remains mysterious. The army shows remarkable craftsmanship, with individually crafted faces and details. It clearly represents the emperor's power and his desire to maintain an army in the afterlife. But questions remain. Why did this practice emerge with Qin Shi Huang when earlier Chinese rulers had sometimes been buried with actual human sacrifices? What specific beliefs about the afterlife motivated this enormous undertaking? The warriors were originally painted in bright colors, now mostly faded. How would they have appeared when first seen? The emperor's tomb itself remains unexcavated, partly because Chinese authorities want to ensure they have adequate conservation technology before opening it. What might be found inside? Similar questions surround the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, now largely destroyed. We know it was an elaborate tomb built for Mausolus, a satrap of the Persian Empire in the 4th century before the Common Era. Fragments survive, but the full structure can only be reconstructed through descriptions and architectural analysis. Why was such an elaborate monument built? What did it signify to those who built it and those who saw it? The question of prehistoric cognition challenges archaeologists. When did humans develop modern cognitive abilities? When did symbolic thinking emerge? When did language as we know it develop? These questions are difficult to answer because cognition doesn't fossilize. We can only infer it from artifacts and behaviors that might reflect symbolic thought. The appearance of art seems to indicate symbolic thinking. The oldest known figurative art, including cave paintings and carved figures, dates to at least 40,000 years ago, possibly older. But simpler forms of symbolic behavior might be much older. Ochre use, shell beads, and other potential symbolic items appear in the archaeological record going back 100,000 years or more. Did these represent true symbolic thinking, or were they simpler behaviors? The question remains open. The peopling of the Americas presents ongoing puzzles. When did humans first arrive in the Americas? The traditional view held that the first Americans crossed from Siberia to Alaska via the Bering Land Bridge around 13,000 years ago, then spread south through an ice-free corridor. However, archaeological sites suggesting earlier human presence have been found, some potentially dating to 15,000 years or more before the present. If humans were in the Americas before the opening of the ice-free corridor, how did they get there? Coastal migration is now considered likely, with people traveling by boat along the Pacific coast. But coastal sites from this period would now be underwater due to sea level rise, making evidence difficult to find. The full story of how and when the Americas were peopled remains incompletely understood. Similar questions surround the peopling of other regions. When did humans reach Australia? How did they get there? The earliest definite evidence suggests people were in Australia at least 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This required multiple sea crossings, indicating that early humans had watercraft and navigational abilities. But we have no physical evidence of these boats, which would have been made from organic materials that haven't survived. The Denisovans, a human group known primarily from genetic evidence and a few fragmentary fossils, represent another mystery. Denisovan DNA has been found in modern human populations, particularly in Southeast Asia and Oceania, indicating that modern humans interbred with this group. But we have almost no physical remains and no clear understanding of what Denisovans looked like, how they lived, or where exactly they lived. They're a ghost population, known to have existed but largely invisible in the archaeological record. The question of Neanderthal capabilities and culture continues to evolve. Neanderthals, once portrayed as primitive brutes, are now known to have been sophisticated humans. They made tools, used fire, cared for the sick and injured, buried their dead, and possibly created art and music. They successfully adapted to Ice Age environments for hundreds of thousands of years. but questions remain about the extent of their symbolic and linguistic capabilities and how these compared to modern humans. The interaction between Neanderthals and modern humans, including interbreeding, hunting and gathering patterns, and possible competition or cooperation, remains partially mysterious. Why did Neanderthals eventually disappear while modern humans survived? Was it competition for resources? Climate change that favored modern human adaptations? Disease? A combination of factors? The question has no definitive answer. Certain artifacts defy explanation, not because they're mysterious in themselves, but because they appear in unexpected contexts. Isolated Roman coins found in locations far from the Roman Empire raise questions about trade networks or later transport. Viking artifacts in North America confirm Norse exploration and temporary settlement, but the full extent of their presence and interaction with Native Americans remains unclear. The archaeological record is filled with small mysteries that individually might not seem significant, but collectively demonstrate how much we don't know. Artifact assemblages that don't match expected patterns. Sites that seem to have been abandoned suddenly for no clear reason. Burials that differ from normal practices in ways we can't explain. Unusual concentrations of particular artifact types in areas where they might not be expected. Each archaeological excavation answers some questions but raises others. This is the nature of the discipline. Physical evidence survives, but context, meaning, and motivation must be inferred. Sometimes the inferences are strong, supported by multiple lines of evidence and fitting well with broader patterns. Sometimes they're tentative, based on limited data and requiring revision as new evidence emerges. Sometimes they're simply speculation, educated guesses about matters that might never be resolved with certainty. The puzzles that archaeology uncovers remind us that the past is not simply there, waiting to be discovered in its entirety. It's a complex reality of which only fragments survive. These fragments must be carefully excavated, analyzed, and interpreted. But interpretation always involves uncertainty. Multiple explanations might fit the same evidence. New discoveries can overturn established theories. What seems clear today might be questioned tomorrow. These ongoing archaeological puzzles, these unsolved mysteries and debated interpretations represent active gaps in our knowledge. They're not simply matters of missing information, things we might find if we looked in the right places. They're fundamental uncertainties about interpretation and meaning, questions that might not have definitive answers because the evidence needed to answer them no longer exists or never existed in a form we can read. Conclusion: living with mystery. We've journeyed together through some of history's greatest mysteries and most significant gaps. From the Bronze Age collapse to the Greek Dark Ages, from the silent cities of the Indus Valley to the enigmatic stones of Göbekli Tepe, from the phantom sea peoples to lost libraries consumed by flames, from the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe to mysterious megalithic monuments, from medieval gaps to unsolved archaeological puzzles, we've explored the spaces where our knowledge of the past falls silent. These gaps aren't just academic concerns. They matter because they shape our understanding of who we are as a species and how we got here. Every civilization we've discussed, every culture that built monuments and cities and writing systems, every society that achieved greatness and then declined or disappeared, they're all part of our shared human story. Understanding them helps us understand ourselves. The gaps remind us of several important truths. First, civilization is fragile. The Bronze Age collapse showed us that even sophisticated, interconnected societies can unravel when faced with multiple simultaneous crises. The lost libraries demonstrate that knowledge, once destroyed, might be lost forever. The disappeared writing systems prove that even fundamental cultural achievements like literacy can be forgotten if not continuously maintained and transmitted. Second, our knowledge of the past is always incomplete. We work with fragments, with the portions of the past that happen to be recorded and whose records happen to survive. Much of human experience leaves no trace that can be recovered millennia later. The voices of ordinary people, particularly the poor, women, children, and marginalized groups, are often silent in the historical record. Their lives were lived, their experiences were real, but they remain largely unknown to us. Third, interpretation is challenging and uncertain. Even when we have evidence, understanding what it means can be difficult. The symbols on Indus seals, the carvings at Göbekli Tepe, the purposes of megalithic monuments, all of these physical traces exist, but their meanings resist our understanding. We are separated from these cultures by vast distances of time and cultural difference. We can describe what they made, but fully understanding why they made it and what it meant to them remains elusive. Fourth, loss is permanent in ways that should humble us. When the Mycenaeans forgot Linear B, when the Maya codices burned, when the Library of Alexandria declined into ruin, knowledge disappeared that can never be recovered. We can sometimes rediscover principles and techniques through independent invention, but the specific thoughts, beliefs, stories, and understanding of those who came before are gone forever. The past isn't waiting to be fully discovered. Much of it is simply gone. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, these gaps teach us about resilience and continuity. After every dark age, after every collapse, human societies found ways to recover, rebuild, and eventually create new forms of civilization. The Bronze Age collapse gave way to the Iron Age kingdoms. The Greek Dark Ages ended with the emergence of classical Greece. The Indus cities fell, but South Asian civilization continued and eventually flourished again in new forms. This resilience is remarkable. It suggests something fundamental about human nature, our capacity to adapt, to remember fragments of what came before, to learn from disaster, and to begin again. Even when writing was lost, when cities were abandoned, when trade networks collapsed, people survived. They preserved what they could, adapted what they must, and eventually rebuilt. The gaps also remind us that history isn't simply a story of progress from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge, from simple to complex. The trajectory isn't always upward. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge is gained and lost. Complexity increases and then sometimes decreases. The Mycenaeans had writing. Their descendants in the Dark Ages did not. The Romans had sophisticated engineering. Medieval Europe took centuries to recover comparable capabilities. Progress isn't inevitable or permanent. This should make us thoughtful about our own civilization. We live in a time of unprecedented knowledge accumulation and technological sophistication. We have libraries, physical and digital, containing more information than any previous civilization could have imagined. We have scientific understanding that our ancestors would have considered magical. We have the ability to preserve and transmit knowledge in ways that seem almost immune to loss. But are we really so different? Our knowledge exists in fragile forms. Digital files require functional hardware and software. Libraries can burn. Languages can be forgotten. If our civilization were to experience catastrophic collapse, how much of what we know would survive? Would future archaeologists be able to read our digital storage media after centuries had passed? Would they understand our languages, our symbols, our purposes? The ancient gaps suggest we should be humble about assuming our knowledge is secure. We should value preservation, redundancy, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. We should recognize that what seems permanent might be temporary, that what seems secure might be vulnerable, that continuity requires conscious effort and cannot be taken for granted. There's also something profound about acknowledging the limits of knowledge. In our age of information abundance, we're not used to accepting that some things simply cannot be known. We expect that enough research, enough data, enough computational power will eventually answer any question. But the gaps in history remind us that some knowledge, once lost, is lost forever. Some questions have no answers because the information needed to answer them no longer exists. This doesn't mean we should stop trying to understand. Archaeological research continues. New techniques emerge. Ancient DNA analysis reveals population movements. Improved dating methods refine chronologies. Computer analysis finds patterns in undeciphered scripts. Satellite imagery discovers hidden structures. Each generation of scholars brings new perspectives and new tools to old mysteries. Sometimes breakthroughs occur. Linear B was undeciphered until Michael Ventris cracked it in 1952, revealing that the Mycenaeans spoke an early form of Greek. The Antikythera mechanism's purpose remained mysterious until modern imaging revealed its complex gearing. New archaeological discoveries occasionally overturn established theories or open unexpected windows on the past. But we should also accept that some mysteries may never be fully solved. We may never read the Indus script. We may never know exactly who the Sea Peoples were or where they came from. We may never fully understand what Göbekli Tepe meant to its builders. The stories told in long-lost libraries may never be recovered, and that's okay. The past doesn't owe us complete answers. There's even something valuable in these mysteries. They remind us that human history is vast and complex, that countless people lived full lives whose details are now unknown to us, that civilizations rose and fell leaving only fragmentary traces. The gaps keep history from becoming too neat, too packaged, too simple. They preserve a sense of wonder and humility. They also remind us that we're part of this ongoing story. Just as people in the past lived their lives not knowing they would become mysterious to future generations, we live our lives not knowing how we'll be remembered. What of our civilization will survive? What future archaeologists will puzzle over? We're creating the future's past, leaving traces that might endure or might disappear, living in ways that might be understood or might be misinterpreted by those who come after us. The gaps in history, the lost epochs, the mysteries and silences, they're part of what it means to be human across deep time. We build, we create, we record, we try to preserve. And time, with its various agents of destruction and forgetting, erases much of what we've made. What survives is partly due to our efforts at preservation and partly due to chance. And those who come after us must work with these fragments, building understanding from incomplete evidence, acknowledging uncertainty, and accepting that some questions may have no answers. As we close this journey through history's gaps and mysteries, perhaps the most important lesson is this: the past teaches us humility. We don't know everything. We can't know everything. And that's not a failure of scholarship or research. It's simply the nature of time and memory, of preservation and loss, of the vast gulf that separates us from those who came before. The stones of Göbekli Tepe stand silent, magnificent, but mute. The cities of the Indus Valley are empty, their script unread. The Sea Peoples have vanished, leaving only Egyptian accounts of their attacks. The great libraries are ashes and dust. The Bronze Age kingdoms are ruins. The knowledge accumulated over centuries is lost. And we, looking back across the millennia, can see what remains but must accept that much of the story is missing, lost in the gaps, hidden in the shadows of the lost epochs. But even in acknowledging these gaps, we honor those who came before us. We recognize that they lived, that they achieved great things, that they were as human as we are, with hopes and dreams and beliefs that mattered to them, even if we cannot fully recover them. The gaps don't diminish their humanity or their achievements. If anything, they make what we can glimpse all the more precious. So we continue to study, to excavate, to analyze, to interpret. We bring new techniques to old questions. We re-examine evidence with fresh eyes. We debate interpretations and refine theories. And sometimes we simply stand in wonder before the ruins and artifacts, acknowledging that while we can describe what we see, the full meaning remains locked in a past we can glimpse but never fully enter. The lost epochs of human history, the gaps and mysteries, the silent centuries and forgotten peoples, they're all part of our collective inheritance. They remind us where we come from, what we've lost, what we've preserved, and what we still have to learn. They keep history alive as a genuine inquiry rather than a closed book. They preserve mystery in an age that often values certainty over wonder. And so we end where we began, with gaps and questions, with mysteries that resist easy answers, with the acknowledgement that human history is vast and strange and only partially known. The lost epochs remain lost, but they're not forgotten. They live on in our curiosity, our research, our imagination, and our willingness to look at the past and admit we don't understand everything we see. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of history. If you enjoyed this exploration, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Library. Your support helps us continue creating these deep dives into history's mysteries. And let me know in the comments what lost epoch or historical mystery intrigues you most. What gaps in history do you find most fascinating? What do you think we might someday discover? And what might remain forever mysterious? Until next time, sleep well, dream of ancient worlds, and remember that the past, for all its gaps and mysteries, is always with us, shaping who we are and reminding us of the long, strange, remarkable journey of human civilization across the millennia. Good night, and thank you for exploring the lost epochs with me.